In 1978, a West Virginia doctor discovered that every Harlan child shared the same father, a man who'd been dead for 40 years. The coal-rich hills of West Virginia in 1935 belonged to families who owned the earth beneath them, and no family owned more than the Harlans. Their mansion sat like a crown on Blackstone Ridge, its white columns gleaming against the perpetual dust cloud rising from their mines below. Inside those walls, crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light, while servants moved silently through rooms decorated with European oil paintings and Persian rugs. But the air itself felt wrong, too still, too heavy, like the house was holding its breath. The Harlans weren't just wealthy, they were obsessed. The patriarch Edmund Harlan believed his bloodline carried a divine right to rule Appalachia, and he enforced a chilling family law: no marriage outside the family. Cousins married cousins. Uncles took nieces as wives. Edmund himself fathered children with his own daughters, calling it preservation of excellence. When neighbors whispered, he bought their silence with jobs. When ministers objected, he built his own church. The family Bible, kept locked in Edmund's study, contained not scripture but genealogy, a twisted family tree where branches looped back into themselves like a noose tightening. By 1940, the Harlan children stopped speaking. All 12 of them. Doctors found nothing physically wrong, but every child over age 7 had simply stopped. The mines began closing in 1947. Coal money dried up, but the Harlans didn't leave Blackstone Ridge. They retreated further into the mansion, boarding windows, dismissing servants. Neighbors reported seeing pale faces pressed against glass at midnight. The local postmaster noticed something strange. The Harlans stopped sending mail to anyone outside the family. They'd created their own world and locked themselves inside it. What happens to the human mind when it's trapped in a bloodline that keeps circling back to itself? The isolation bred something worse than poverty. It bred collapse. By 1960, the mansion's interior was described by a rare visitor as medieval, unwashed, candlelit, smelling of mildew and something sweeter, sicker. The Harlan children, now adults, spoke only to each other in a dialect neighbors couldn't understand. Some walked with strange gaits. Others had facial features that seemed compressed, eyes too close together, jaws too narrow. In 1978, Dr. Helena Price was called to the mansion to treat a teenage girl's seizures. What she found in the medical records locked in Edmund's study would destroy the family's last secret. Every birth certificate, every child, every generation since 1920. The same father listed, Edmund Harlan. Even children born after his death in 1938. Dr. Price realized the dates were falsified, but the genetics weren't. DNA tests later confirmed it. 40 years of interbreeding had created a genetic bottleneck so severe that every living Harlan shared more DNA with each other than most siblings do. The mansion still stands today, empty but not abandoned. Local teens dare each other to spend nights there. They report hearing children's laughter in empty hallways. Like the Rockefeller dynasty's hidden eugenics programs or the Habsburg jaw, the Harlans proved that some families don't just fall from grace, they breed their own destruction. But one secret was still waiting in Edmund's study, a locked drawer Dr. Price never opened, containing letters to someone called the Shepherd. Someone who'd been visiting the mansion long after Edmund died. Someone who might still be alive. The Harlan family doctor kept 2 sets of records, one for the county, one for God. Dr. Marcus Webb had served the Harlans since 1922, when Edmund first summoned him to Blackstone Ridge with an offer no country physician could refuse: a lifetime salary, a cottage on the estate, and one condition: absolute silence. Webb accepted. He had no idea what he was accepting into. The first birth he attended seemed routine. A healthy boy born to Edmund's eldest daughter, Catherine. Webb filled out the certificate, noted the father as Catherine's husband, Thomas Harlan, her first cousin. Standard practice for wealthy families protecting inheritance lines. But when he prepared to leave, Edmund stopped him at the door. "There's another record book," Edmund said, his voice calm as Sunday prayer. "The true one in my study." The true record book listed Edmund himself as the father, not Thomas. Catherine's husband was merely a legal fiction, a name on paper to satisfy the state. Webb's hands shook as he wrote Edmund's name in the leather-bound journal. The pages were already half filled with entries dating back years, all in Edmund's own handwriting. Each one listed him as father to children officially recorded as his grandchildren, nieces, nephews. The family tree wasn't branching, it was spiraling inward, collapsing into a single point: Edmund Harlan. "You're a man of science," Edmund told him, pouring bourbon into crystal glasses that caught the lamplight like amber ice. "You understand bloodlines, racehorses, breeding stock. Why should humans be different?" The bourbon smelled sharp, medicinal. Webb drank it anyway, trying to wash away what he just documented. At what point does a doctor become an accomplice to his own horror? Over the next 16 years, Webb delivered 23 children on Blackstone Ridge, 23 entries in Edmund's secret book. By 1935, he'd stopped questioning the arrangement. The money was good, the isolation was complete, and something else had changed. Webb himself had stopped seeing the Harlans as entirely human. They'd become specimens, a long-term study in genetic compression. He took detailed notes on abnormalities, the slight webbing between fingers, the unusually high incidence of seizures, the way certain children's eyes reflected light at odd angles, like animals caught in lamplight. In 1938, when Edmund died of a stroke in his study, Webb discovered something that made him vomit into the fireplace. Edmund had been documenting his own genetic decline, tracking his fertility, dosing himself with experimental compounds ordered from Europe. The study desk drawers contained vials of hormones, sketches of family trees with mathematical notations, and letters from a German eugenicist named Dr. Friedrich Holm. Edmund hadn't just been preserving his bloodline. He'd been trying to perfect it, using his own family as laboratory subjects. Halton's letters praised Edmund's courage and vision, calling the Harlan experiment the purest genetic study outside controlled laboratory conditions. Webb burned the letters that night, but he kept the medical records, both sets. Some part of him knew the truth would eventually demand an accounting. After Edmund's death, the births continued. That's what finally broke Webb's silence 30 years later, in 1968, when he was dying of lung cancer in a Charleston hospital. He told a young resident about Blackstone Ridge, about the two record books, about children born years after Edmund's death who still carried his genetic signature. "They're not using his name anymore," Webb whispered, his breath rattling like coins in a tin cup. "But the blood is still his. They saved it, preserved it, like he was some kind of sacred seed." The resident thought Webb was hallucinating, morphine-induced rambling. He wrote nothing down. Webb died that night, his confession evaporating like steam. But he'd left clues, the location of his own hidden journals, buried in a metal box beneath his old cottage foundation. Journals that detailed every birth, every abnormality, every moment he'd chosen salary over soul. The Epstein network had its flight logs. The Rockefellers had their eugenics foundations. The Harlans had Dr. Webb, a man who documented his own damnation with clinical precision, one birth certificate at a time. But Webb's journals mention something else. A shepherd who visited Edmund monthly, carrying leather cases and speaking German. A man who continued visiting Blackstone Ridge for years after Edmund died. A man whose real name Webb never learned, but whose signature appeared on shipping receipts for medical supplies delivered to the mansion as late as 1965. The Harlan children didn't just stop speaking. They invented their own language that no outsider could understand. By 1941, the 12 children living in Blackstone Ridge had become something else entirely. Linguists have a term for what happened: cryptophagia, twin language, private speech. But the Harlan children weren't twins. They were cousins, half-siblings, nieces and nephews to each other in combinations that defied normal family structure. And their language wasn't playful childhood gibberish. It was defensive. Mrs. Dorothy Keene, the last governess brave enough to accept employment at the mansion, kept a diary that surfaced in a Charleston estate sale in 1989. Her entries from March to August 1941 read like dispatches from a foreign country. "The children speak in whispers that sound like wind through broken glass," she wrote. "They use words I don't recognize. When I ask them to repeat in English, they stare at me with identical expressions, not hostile but empty, like I've ceased to exist." The children had developed a 200-word vocabulary completely separate from English, with its own grammar structure and syntax, a linguistic fortress built to keep the outside world out. Dorothy recorded fragments phonetically. Shemka relvo meant something about food. Dorn Silpe was repeated whenever strangers approached. Krelma Edmund was whispered like a prayer before meals. The children used it exclusively with each other, switching to broken English only when absolutely necessary for communication with adults. But even their English had deteriorated flat, affectless, stripped of emotion. The youngest, 7-year-old Margaret was the last to stop speaking English entirely. Dorothy watched it happen over 3 weeks in July. Margaret's sentences became shorter, then fragmented, then replaced completely by the private language her siblings used. On July 23rd, Margaret said her final English words to Dorothy: "The house doesn't want your words here." What happens to children whose only reality is each other, whose only history is written in blood they're forced to share? Dorothy lasted 5 months. The isolation wasn't physical. The mansion had electricity, running water, enough food. It was psychological. The children moved through rooms like a single organism, always in groups, never alone. They ate in synchronized motions. They turned pages of books at the same moment. When one laughed, rare, unsettling, the others would join in exact intervals later, like an echo spreading through empty hallways. At night, Dorothy heard them. Not separate voices, but a chorus, all 12 children speaking their language in unison, the sound rising through floorboards like a chant. She'd press her ear to the cold wood and feel the vibrations in her skull. The rhythm was too perfect, too coordinated. It sounded almost rehearsed, like they were performing some ritual they'd been practicing for years. Dorothy discovered why when she found the basement teaching room, a windowless stone chamber where Edmund had conducted family education sessions before his death, teaching the children to speak in code so outsiders could never truly enter their world. The room smelled of mildew and candle wax. On the wall, Edmund had painted the family tree in white chalk, but it was circular, not vertical, with his name at the center and lines radiating outward before curving back. Beneath it, a list of words in 2 columns, English on the left, the private language on the right. Mother became Krelna. Father became Krelma. But there were words that had no English equivalent, sounds the children made that apparently described concepts only they understood. Dorothy left Blackstone Ridge on August 19, 1941, walking the 7 miles to town before dawn. She never collected her final wages. Her diary ends with one sentence: "They're not children anymore. They're something Edmund made, and they're still making themselves." Modern cases of isolated children, the feral child Jeannie, the silent twins June and Jennifer Gibbons, show what extreme isolation does to language development. But the Harlan children were different. They weren't deprived of language. They chose a different one, weaponizing communication itself as a barrier between their bloodline and everyone else. Like the secretive Rothschild family codes or the Vatican's sealed archives, the Harlans understood: control language, control reality. But Dorothy's diary mentioned one word she heard repeatedly, always spoken with reverence, always late at night when the children thought she was asleep: Haltenschem. A word that sounded German, a word that appeared nowhere in Edmund's teaching room. A word that suggested someone else had been teaching the children, someone who visited after Edmund died, someone they called by a name that meant shepherd of blood. When the coal mines closed in 1947, the Harlans didn't leave. They barricaded themselves inside and started burning their own furniture for warmth. The economic collapse hit Appalachia like a fist. Overnight, the mines that had fed families for generations went dark. Men who'd spent their lives underground emerged to find the surface had abandoned them. Towns emptied. Mansions were sold for fractions of their worth. Smart families liquidated and fled to Pittsburgh, to Cleveland, to anywhere with jobs. The Harlans did the opposite. Sheriff Tom Bridger made the final welfare check in November 1947. Climbing the winding road to Blackstone Ridge with a county social worker named Ellen Price, no relation to the doctor who'd come decades later. What they found violated every assumption about how wealthy families behaved in crisis. The mansion's windows were boarded from the inside. The front door was chained. When they knocked, the sound echoed through empty hills like a judge's gavel. "We're not leaving," a voice called from behind the door. Male, adult, but with strange, flat affect. "We have everything we need here." Through gaps in the boards, Sheriff Bridger saw the interior had been transformed, furniture piled as barricades, chandeliers torn down, and symbols painted on the walls in what looked like dried blood. The social worker noted the smell. Wood smoke, yes, but also something organic and wrong, like rotting flowers. No lights were visible inside despite it being mid-afternoon. When Ellen pressed her face to a crack between boards, she saw movement in the darkness, multiple figures, adults and children, all standing completely still, watching the door. Not moving, not speaking, just waiting for the outsiders to leave. "There are children in there," Ellen told the sheriff. "We have a legal obligation." "We're American citizens on private property," the voice interrupted, closer now, just on the other side of the door. "We're not breaking any laws. We're not asking for help. Leave us alone." When does isolation become imprisonment? When does a family become a cult? Sheriff Bridger had no legal grounds for forced entry. No crime had been reported. No one inside was requesting rescue. He filed his report with the county and moved on. But Ellen Price couldn't. She'd seen something through that gap in the boards that haunted her. One of the children, maybe 10 years old, with a face that seemed compressed, features too close together, eyes reflecting lamplight with an amber glow that human eyes shouldn't produce. Over the next 2 years, local hunters reported seeing smoke from Blackstone Ridge's chimneys even in summer. The mailman stopped delivering because the box at the property gate was nailed shut with a handwritten sign. No outside correspondence. Grocery deliveries that the Harlans had once received weekly simply stopped, implying they were either growing their own food or eating through stockpiles Edmund had accumulated. In 1949, a fire crew responding to a brush fire on Harlan property saw through ground floor windows. The family was burning Edmund's furniture, his books, the oil paintings, everything that represented the outside world's culture and history. The French provincial chairs worth thousands. The library Edmund had spent decades assembling. The carved mahogany dining table that had hosted West Virginia senators. All of it reduced to ash and heat. The fire chief, Daniel Cross, wrote in his incident report, "They were feeding the fire with a piano, a full grand piano, piece by piece. When they saw us watching, they closed the curtains. We heard singing inside, all voices in unison, no harmony, just one pitch sustained for minutes." This wasn't poverty. This was transformation. The Harlans were systematically erasing every connection to the external world, burning away their own past like they were purifying themselves. Anthropologists have documented similar behavior in isolated religious communities, the Shakers, the Hutterites, but those groups at least maintained some contact with outside society. The Harlans were choosing complete severance. Like the wealthy Mitford sisters who embraced fascism, or the isolated Friedman family who starved themselves for purity, the Harlans proved that money doesn't buy sanity. Sometimes it just funds the construction of more elaborate prisons. But one detail in Sheriff Bridger's report was never explained. When he asked the voice behind the door for a name, for someone in the family he could follow up with, the voice answered with 3 words in that strange private language the children spoke. Then, in English, "The shepherd says we're ready now." Ready for what? The sheriff never found out. 3 months later, when he drove back to Blackstone Ridge to perform another welfare check, the chains were still on the door, but fresh chains, new locks, as if someone had come and gone and secured everything from the inside again. In 1953, a traveling salesman knocked on the Harlan door and vanished for 3 days before staggering out with no memory and symbols carved into his forearm. His name was Robert Milliken, a Fuller Brush man working the rural routes through West Virginia, selling cleaning supplies and kitchen goods door to door. He'd heard the rumors about Blackstone Ridge, the sealed mansion, the strange family, but rumors meant nothing to a man who needed to make quota. Besides, wealthy families were his best customers, even reclusive ones. He knocked at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in June. The door opened. That was the last thing anyone saw until Friday morning, when Robert stumbled out of the woods 3 miles from the property, his suit torn, his eyes unfocused, babbling about the children's circle and the teaching. His left forearm bore fresh cuts, not random, but deliberate, carved in a pattern that looked like a family tree collapsing inward on itself. When doctors examined him at Morgantown General, they found traces of a sedative in his blood that hadn't been commercially available since 1938 and wouldn't be manufactured again until 1955. Robert couldn't explain where he'd been. His memory of those 3 days existed in fragments, like shattered glass reflecting disconnected images. He remembered the door opening not to a person, but to several people, all standing in a line, all staring with identical expressions. He remembered being led inside, through hallways that smelled of wet stone and something sweet he couldn't identify. He remembered children's voices speaking in unison, but couldn't recall the words. And he remembered pain, sharp, precise, as something cut into his arm while hands held him still, and voices told him he was marked now, that he was witnessed, that he'd been shown the blood's truth. What could a family so isolated do to an outsider that would erase 3 days from his memory? The police investigated. Sheriff Bridger, now older and more cautious, drove to Blackstone Ridge with 2 deputies. The door was chained again. No one answered his knocking. He circled the property, peering through gaps in the boards, but saw nothing except darkness and, in one ground-floor room, what looked like a circle drawn on the floor in white powder or chalk. Robert's carved symbols were photographed and sent to the state police, who forwarded them to a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins specializing in cult behavior. Dr. Lawrence Finn examined the photos and wrote back within days. These markings are consistent with ritualistic scarification practices seen in isolated religious communities, particularly those with obsessive genealogical focus. The pattern suggests a family tree, but inverted, roots growing upward, branches growing inward. Robert Milliken never fully recovered. He quit his sales job, moved back to his mother's house in Ohio, and spent the rest of his life, another 43 years, drawing the same symbol over and over on notebook paper, filling dozens of journals with variations of the inverted tree. Before his death in 1996, Robert gave one interview to a local newspaper. The reporter asked him what happened at Blackstone Ridge. Robert stared at his scarred forearm and said, "They weren't keeping the world out. They were keeping themselves in, and they wanted me to understand why. They wanted a witness, someone who'd carry the mark back to the outside and prove their bloodline was still working." Working on what? Robert couldn't or wouldn't say. The sedative found in his blood posed another mystery. Doctors identified it as a compound called ethchlorvinol, sold under the brand name Placidil. But the timeline made no sense. The drug was discontinued in 1938 due to dangerous side effects and wasn't reintroduced until 1955 after reformulation. How did the Harlans have a supply in 1953? Had Edmund stockpiled medications before his death? Or was someone still supplying the family with pharmaceutical compounds through some hidden channel? Modern cases echo Robert's experience. The isolated Turpin children in California, the Ariel Castro kidnappings, the NXIVM cult brandings. In each case, isolation enabled ritualistic control, and outsiders who glimpsed inside carried psychological scars that never fully healed. But the Harlans added something worse. They chose their victims, specifically targeting someone who could leave and tell the story, turning witnesses into unwilling evangelists for their genetic gospel. Robert mentioned one detail that never made it into police reports, something he only shared with his mother on his deathbed. During those lost 3 days, he saw someone else inside the mansion. Not a Harlan, an older man, European accent, carrying a leather medical bag and speaking that private language the children used. A man the family called Halt. A man who smiled when Robert screamed during the carving and whispered in English, "The blood remembers everything, and now so will you." In 1961, the Harlan children, now adults in their 30s, began appearing in town for the first time in 14 years, buying supplies with century-old gold coins. The first sighting happened at Dunley's General Store on a gray October morning. The bell above the door chimed, and Martha Dunley looked up from her register to see 3 figures standing motionless in the entrance. 2 women and 1 man, dressed in clothing that seemed stitched together from different eras, Victorian collars, 1920s hemlines, work boots caked with mud that smelled like limestone and copper. Their faces stopped her breath. The resemblance between them wasn't familial, it was photographic. Same narrow jaw, same spacing between eyes, Same slight asymmetry in the left cheekbone, like three prints from a single negative, aged at different rates. The man's hair was prematurely white. One woman had a tremor in her left hand that made her fingers twitch in rhythmic patterns. The other woman's eyes reflected the overhead lights with that same amber quality Ellen Price had reported years before. "We need supplies," the man said. His voice was flat, accentless, like someone who'd learned English from a textbook but never heard it spoken naturally. When Martha asked how they'd like to pay, the man placed 17 gold coins on the counter, Morgan silver dollars from 1893, each worth hundreds of dollars, covered in dirt as if they'd just been unearthed. Martha had never seen this much wealth in physical form. The coins were genuine. She checked them against her husband's collector's guide that night. But more disturbing than their value was their condition, freshly excavated, as if the Harlans had buried their fortune decades ago and were only now digging it up, piece by piece, as they needed it. The three Harlans loaded their purchases in silence: flour, sugar, salt, lamp oil, medical gauze, and strangest of all, 5 bottles of hydrogen peroxide and a box of scalpels. Martha tried to make conversation, asked about the weather, about how they were managing up at the mansion. They answered in single-word responses, sometimes glancing at each other before speaking, as if silently conferring in that private language they'd invented as children. Before leaving, the woman with the tremor turned back and said something that made Martha's skin crawl. "More of us will come soon. The bloodline is multiplying." How many people were living inside Blackstone Ridge? And if the children were now adults, whose children were being born? Over the next 6 months, different Harlan adults appeared in town, always in groups of 2 or 3, never alone, always paying with those ancient coins, always buying the same mixture of basic supplies and medical equipment. The townspeople began keeping a tally. They'd counted at least 8 different Harlan adults, plus glimpses of younger people, teenagers perhaps, or small adults, who stayed in whatever vehicle they'd driven down in, usually an ancient truck from the 1940s that barely ran, belching black smoke. In March 1962, a young pharmacist named David Chen violated protocol and asked a Harlan woman direct questions about the medical supplies they were constantly purchasing: bandages, antiseptics, syringes, antibiotics when available. "Is someone sick?" David asked gently. He was new to town, unfamiliar with the unspoken rule: don't ask the Harlans anything. The woman, maybe 30 years old, with that characteristic compressed facial structure, stared at him for a full 10 seconds before answering. "We're managing the blood. Some bodies reject it. We correct this." "Reject what? Are you running some kind of medical facility?" "We're running a family." She placed a gold coin on the counter, overpaying by at least $40. "The blood must stay pure. This requires adjustments." David never asked again, but he kept records of their purchases, documenting a pattern that suggested serious medical interventions happening inside the mansion. Enough antibiotics to treat multiple infections, surgical supplies, even obstetric equipment. His notes, discovered in a storage unit in 2003, painted a disturbing picture. The Harlans weren't just surviving in isolation. They were operating, performing procedures, treating complications, dealing with medical crises that should have required hospitalization. The pharmacist's records noted one purchase that stood out. In July 1962, a Harlan man bought every bottle of folic acid in the store, a supplement crucial for preventing birth defects, especially those related to genetic abnormalities. The implications were inescapable. Births were happening at Blackstone Ridge, multiple births, and the family knew enough about genetics to understand they needed intervention to keep the bloodline viable. Modern genetic science confirms what the Harlans instinctively understood. Extreme inbreeding creates a phenomenon called inbreeding depression, increased infant mortality, higher rates of genetic disorders, and decreased fertility. Royal families throughout history faced this. The Spanish Habsburgs, the Egyptian pharaohs, the European hemophilia lines. But most royal families eventually introduced outside blood. The Harlans never did. They just kept correcting, kept managing, kept forcing biology to submit to bloodline purity through sheer medical intervention and will. But David Chen's records included one final note, dated August 1962, that he never shared with anyone. A Harlan woman came in asking about specialty compounds. She had a list, handwritten in perfect German script, signed at the bottom with a name that made David's blood cold. Dr. Friedrich Halton, the same name that appeared in Edmund's old letters. The same name Robert Milliken heard whispered inside the mansion. A man who, if he was Edmund's contemporary in the 1930s, should now be in his 70s or 80s. Yet the Harlans spoke about him in present tense, as if he was still visiting, still treating, still guiding their genetic experiment from somewhere outside time itself. A county health inspector tried to enter Blackstone Ridge in 1965. The Harlans met him at the gate with a line of children, all holding hands, all completely silent. His name was Gerald Moss, and he'd been sent by the state after anonymous complaints about unsanitary conditions and potential child welfare violations. The complaints were vague, probably from townspeople uncomfortable with the Harlans' increasingly frequent appearances, but they were enough to trigger a mandatory inspection. Gerald had conducted hundreds of these visits across Appalachia, poverty-stricken homes, families living without electricity or running water, situations where children genuinely needed intervention. Nothing prepared him for what he found at the top of that winding mountain road. The gate was open. That alone was unusual. For years it had been chained, locked, an iron barrier between the Harlans and the world. But on this September morning it stood wide, almost inviting. Gerald parked his county vehicle and walked toward the mansion, clipboard in hand, rehearsing his standard introduction. He made it 30 feet before he saw them. 17 children stood in a perfect line across the driveway, arranged by height from shortest to tallest, all holding hands, all wearing identical gray clothing that looked hand-sewn from the same rough fabric. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched him approach with eyes that caught the morning light and reflected it back with that characteristic amber glow. Gerald stopped walking. The silence was absolute, no birds, no wind, just the sound of his own breathing and the distant creak of the mansion settling behind them. "Hello," Gerald said, forcing professional warmth into his voice. "I'm from the county health department. I need to speak with your parents." Nothing. The children didn't respond, didn't acknowledge his words, but their grip on each other's hands tightened. He could see their knuckles going white. "Is there an adult I can talk to?" The oldest child, a girl maybe 15, though her compressed features made aging difficult, opened her mouth. What came out wasn't English. It was that private language, those wind-through-broken glass sounds that Dorothy Keene had documented 24 years earlier. The girl spoke for perhaps 30 seconds, her voice monotone, and every other child's lips moved in perfect synchronization, mouthing her words like a chorus following a lead singer. How do you conduct a welfare check on children who have been taught that outsiders are the threat, that silence is survival, that their bloodline is the only reality worth protecting? Gerald tried to step around the line. The children moved as one, repositioning to block his path without breaking formation, without releasing each other's hands. Their faces remained expressionless. It wasn't defiance. It was something more disturbing, more programmed. Like they'd rehearsed this exact scenario, knew precisely how to respond to outsider intrusion without ever being told. I have legal authority to enter this property, Gerald said, voice less steady now. I'm here to ensure you're all safe and healthy. The girl spoke again in that private language. This time, Gerald heard something familiar buried in the strange sounds. A name, Halton, repeated twice with what sounded like reverence. Then, from behind the children, an adult voice called out in English, "You have no authority here." A man emerged from the mansion's shadowed entrance. Not a Harlan, Gerald could tell immediately, because his features were different, sharper, European, wearing a white medical coat stained with something rust-colored around the cuffs. The man was elderly, perhaps 70, with steel-gray hair and eyes that were startlingly blue against weathered skin. He carried a leather medical bag, the old-fashioned kind doctors abandoned decades ago. When he walked, he moved with authority, and the children remained frozen in place, still holding hands, still blocking the driveway. "These children are healthy," the man said, his accent German precise. "They are educated. They are loved. You have no legal grounds for intrusion." "Sir, I need to see inside the home. Speak with the legal guardians." "I am their physician. I examine them regularly. I can provide documentation." Gerald's hands were shaking now. Something was deeply wrong, but he couldn't articulate what. The children were clean, clothed, not obviously malnourished. The man's credentials seemed legitimate, though Gerald never verified them. And yet every instinct screamed that he was looking at something illegal, something that violated laws he couldn't name. The German man pulled a folder from his bag and handed it to Gerald, 17 medical examination forms, all dated within the last month, all signed Dr. Friedrich Halton, M.D., all showing normal vital signs except for one repeated note. Consanguinity coefficient, monitored. Consanguinity, the medical term for blood relation between parents. Gerald knew the word from his training, knew it appeared in genetic counseling contexts, in cases where cousins married and doctors tracked potential complications. But seeing it written 17 times, on 17 different children's charts, all marked as requiring active monitoring. "You're aware this is irregular," Gerald said weakly. "I'm aware this family maintains traditions you don't understand," Dr. Halton replied. "But maintaining tradition is not a crime in America. These children are thriving under my care. You will find no evidence of abuse, neglect, or malnutrition. You will leave now." Gerald left. He filed his report that afternoon. No violations observed. Family physician present and providing adequate care. Children appear healthy though unusually reserved. No grounds for further investigation. He lied. He knew he was lying. But when he closed his eyes at night, he saw those 17 children standing in formation, hands locked together, forming a human barrier between their bloodline and the outside world. And he knew with terrible certainty that even if he'd gotten inside the mansion, even if he'd seen whatever was happening in those darkened rooms, no law existed that could stop it. Like the Jonestown families before the massacre, like the Branch Davidian children at Waco, The Harlan children were being raised inside a reality where outsider intervention was the threat, where genetic purity was divine mandate, where suffering was reframed as sacred duty. But Gerald kept one page from Dr. Halton's folder, a page he never included in his report, a handwritten note in German that had fallen loose, addressed to someone called the Council. Gerald had it translated years later by a college professor. It read, "Generation 5 shows promising stability. The corrections are working. We may finally have bred past the worst defects. Continue current protocols. The American experiment succeeds where European attempts failed." Edmund's vision was correct. Isolation is the key. In 20 more years, they will be perfect. In 1970, a Harlan woman walked into a West Virginia hospital in active labor, and the delivery room staff discovered she was also her baby's aunt, grandmother, and cousin. Her name was listed as Sarah Harlan, age 23, though her medical chart would later note estimated age uncertain. Patient appears both younger and older than stated. She arrived alone at Charleston Memorial Hospital at 2 a.m. on a March morning, contractions 5 minutes apart, refusing to answer questions about the father, about prenatal care, about anything except her immediate need to deliver. Dr. Patricia Chen, no relation to the pharmacist, was the attending ob-gyn. She delivered hundreds of bobbies in rural West Virginia, seen complications from poverty, from lack of healthcare access, from teenage pregnancies and addiction. But Sarah Harlan's case would haunt her for the rest of her career. "The moment I examined her, I knew something was wrong," Dr. Chen told a medical ethics board in 1979. "Not wrong with the pregnancy exactly, wrong with everything." Sarah's physical anomalies were subtle but everywhere. Webbed toes, a heart murmur, slight facial asymmetry, and bone density scans that showed evidence of childhood rickets despite her claims of adequate nutrition. But the delivery itself went smoothly. A boy, 7 pounds, healthy lungs, normal UPGAR scores. Dr. Chen cleaned him, wrapped him, handed him to Sarah, who held the infant with an expression that wasn't joy or relief or exhaustion. It was assessment, clinical and cold, like she was evaluating a product. "What will you name him?" the nurse asked. "Edmund," Sarah said immediately. "They're all Edmund now." The nurse and Dr. Chen exchanged glances. "They're all." Sarah didn't elaborate. She nursed the baby with mechanical efficiency, then requested discharge within 6 hours, far too soon by medical standards. When Dr. Chen refused, citing both Sarah's health and the need for standard infant monitoring, Sarah became agitated for the first time. "I need to take him back. They're waiting. They need to examine him." Who were they? And what kind of examination required a 6-hour-old infant to be removed from professional medical care? Dr. Chen stalled, ordered additional tests. Blood work on both mother and child. That's when the real nightmare began. Sarah's blood type was OB negative, rare but not impossible. The baby's was B positive. But when the lab ran a standard paternity panel, routine for single mothers at the time, the results came back flagged with red marks and a note requesting Dr. Chen call the lab director immediately. "I've never seen anything like this," the lab director, Dr. Marcus Webb, yes, that Webb, now in his 70s, working his final years in Charleston, told her over the phone. "The genetic markers suggest the father is simultaneously the patient's brother, father, and cousin. The DNA is. Patricia, this child is the product of at least 3 generations of continuous inbreeding, maybe more." Dr. Chen felt her stomach drop. "That's not medically possible." "It's not likely," Webb corrected. but it's possible if a family has been strategically inbreeding with minimal genetic variation for decades. This child has a coefficient of inbreeding around 0.35 to zero point 0.4. For context, anything above 0.25, the level of children born from father-daughter or brother-sister unions, is considered extreme. A coefficient of zero point 0.4 suggested something beyond simple incest. It suggested systematic genetic concentration over multiple generations, a breeding program designed to eliminate outside DNA entirely. When Dr. Chen confronted Sarah with the genetic findings and expressed concern for the child's long-term health, Sarah smiled for the first time, a strange, knowing smile that showed teeth too small for her mouth. "Our blood is stronger than yours," Sarah said quietly. "Dr. Halton proved it. We've bred past the weakness. This baby will live. They all live now." "Who is Dr. Halton?" "Our shepherd. He's been guiding us since my grandfather's time. He understands what American doctors don't. Purity creates strength, not weakness. You just have to manage the corrections." Dr. Chen tried to contact Child Protective Services, but Sarah Harlan had committed no crime. She delivered a healthy baby. The genetic situation was disturbing but not illegal, and by the time CPS could send someone to interview Sarah, she'd vanished from the hospital, signed herself out against medical advice, took the baby, and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness. Hospital security footage showed Sarah leaving through a side exit where a black vehicle waited, driver not visible. But audio equipment near the door captured something chilling. Multiple voices from inside the vehicle, all speaking in unison in that private Harlan language, and a baby crying that cut off suddenly, mid-wail, as if silenced by something pressed over its face. Dr. Chen filed reports with every agency she could think of. Police, CPS, the State Health Department, the FBI. Nothing came of it. The Harlans weren't fugitives. They'd broken no laws. The baby was theirs. And without evidence of immediate harm, no one could justify forced intervention. Dr. Marcus Webb, the elderly lab director, called Dr. Chen 1 week later with information he'd never shared with anyone. "I delivered Harlan Bobbies in the 1930s. I kept records. Sarah isn't 23, she's probably closer to 40. They age strangely because of the genetics. And that baby isn't the first Edmund born this year. Based on purchase patterns from the pharmacy records I've been tracking, I estimate there are at least 6 infants at Blackstone Ridge right now. All boys, all probably named Edmund. They're trying to replicate the founder, not just preserve his bloodline, recreate him. Like the cloning experiments of the Raelian cult, or the genetic preservation attempts of wealthy elites storing DNA for future resurrection. The Harlans had weaponized reproduction itself, turning their bodies into factories for producing genetic copies of a man who'd been dead for 32 years. But Dr. Webb mentioned one more thing before hanging up. "When I delivered Sarah in 1950, her mother died in childbirth. But before she died, she whispered something to me. Halton takes the failed ones. He takes them away for study. We never see them again. Patricia, what happened to the Harlan Bobbies who weren't healthy enough to keep?" A midnight fire in 1973 brought fire trucks to Blackstone Ridge, and firefighters found operating tables in the basement, still warm. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on November 3rd. Flames visible from the south wing of the Harlan mansion, thick black smoke billowing into the autumn sky. The Clearwater Volunteer Fire Department responded with 2 trucks and 11 men, Chief Daniel Cross leading them up that winding mountain road for the second time in his career. This time, the gates weren't chained. They hung open, swaying slightly in the wind that carried the smell of burning wood and something else, something chemical, medicinal, that made the firefighters' eyes water before they even reached the building. The fire itself was contained to one section, a second-floor bedroom where old furniture had been stacked and set ablaze. Almost deliberately, Chief Cross noted in his report, like someone wanted the fire department there, wanted outsiders to witness something, wanted the secret to crack open. While half the crew fought the flames, Cross and two others entered the main house to check for victims, for anyone who might be trapped or overcome by smoke. They found the operating room instead. In the basement, behind a door marked with that inverted family tree symbol Robert Millikan had described, they discovered a fully equipped surgical suite, operating tables, overhead lights, medical equipment ranging from the 1940s to modern, and walls lined with glass jars containing preserved tissue samples. The tables were still warm. Someone had been using them recently, within hours. Bloodstains marked the floor beneath them, old stains layered with fresh ones, decades of medical procedures performed in this underground room that smelled like formaldehyde and desperation. Chief Cross's flashlight swept across the jars. Inside, floating in amber preservative, organs, small organs, infant organs, each jar labeled in precise handwriting, dates, measurements, notations in German and English. Subject 14, cardiac malformation, expired day 3. Subject 21, neural tube defect, terminated week 8. Subject 27, viable extraction, sent to Halton facility. Jesus Christ, whispered firefighter Tom Bradley, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. They've been operating on their own children down here. How many children had been born at Blackstone Ridge? And how many had survived past these basement tables? The equipment was sophisticated. An X-ray machine from the 1960s, ultrasound equipment, surgical instruments ranging from antique to modern, all meticulously cleaned and arranged. Medical textbooks stacked on shelves, genetics, pediatric surgery, obstetrics, and one entire shelf devoted to works in German by someone named Friedrich Halton. Titles like Preserving Genetic Purity Through Managed Selection and Corrective Surgery in Consanguineous Populations. But the most disturbing discovery came when Tom Bradley opened a metal filing cabinet in the corner. Birth records, dozens of them. Children born at Blackstone Ridge going back to 1940, all documented with clinical precision. Names all variations of Edmund or Catherine, Edmund's wife's name, dates, genetic markers, and a column marked status. Out of 47 births recorded since 1940, only 19 were marked viable kept. The rest were marked corrected removed, terminated severe defect, or simply Halton study. 28 children, dead or taken somewhere else or used for medical study. The Harlans hadn't just been managing their genetic collapse, they'd been culling it, eliminating the failures, preserving only the specimens that met their standards of purity. Chief Cross photographed everything with his Polaroid camera, even as his hands shook so badly the images came out blurred. He needed evidence, proof that this wasn't a nightmare, that he'd actually witnessed what looked like a decades-long eugenics program operating in the basement of an American mansion. By the time they'd finished documenting the operating room, the fire upstairs was extinguished, and the Harlans had vanished. All of them. The mansion stood empty, doors open, as if the family had evacuated during the fire and simply never returned. Except they'd taken everything important. The recent medical records, the tissue samples, the living family members. They'd left only the historical records, the old equipment, the evidence from decades past. Almost like they were done with this location, ready to abandon it now that outsiders had finally seen inside. In the operating room, stuck to one of the tables with dried blood, Cross found a handwritten note in English. The American phase concludes, 28 failures, 19 successes. Coefficient now stabilized at 0.42. Generation 6 shows no major defects. The European facility will continue the work. Thank you for your service to genetic science. Dr. F. Halton, 1973. Cross contacted state police immediately. They arrived at dawn, documented everything, and launched an investigation that went nowhere. The Harlans were gone. No forwarding address, no paper trail, just an empty mansion full of evidence of medical procedures that, technically, weren't illegal if performed by licensed physicians on family members who consented. And Dr. Friedrich Halm, no record existed of his American medical license. No passport entries, no immigration documents, no proof he'd ever legally entered the country. He was a ghost, a name signed on decades of documents but attached to no verifiable human being. The preserved organs were sent to the state medical examiner, who confirmed they were human, mostly fetal or infant, showing various genetic abnormalities consistent with extreme inbreeding. But without living victims, without bodies, without anyone to press charges on behalf of, the investigation closed within 6 months. Like Joseph Mengele escaping to South America, like the Tuskegee experiments that continued for decades with government knowledge, like the forced sterilization programs in 32 American states, the Harlan medical experiments proved that some horrors operate in plain sight, documented and systematic, until the moment they're exposed, and then they simply relocate. Chief Cross kept one document he never turned over to police, a shipping manifest dated October 1973, 1 week before the fire, showing a cargo shipment from Charleston to Bremen, Germany. Contents listed: medical specimens, genetic research materials, temperature-controlled transport required. Signed for by Halton Institute, Basel Division. And at the bottom, a handwritten note: final transfer, 3 viable subjects, ages 2-6 for continued study. The American breeding program succeeded. Now we perfect them. In 1978, Dr. Helena Price received a midnight phone call from a voice that whispered, "One of us is dying. Come alone or she dies alone." Dr. Price was a neurologist specializing in genetic disorders, newly established in Charleston after completing her residency at Johns Hopkins. She'd heard the Harlan stories. Every doctor in West Virginia had, but dismissed them as rural mythology, the kind of Gothic folklore that accumulates around wealthy, reclusive families. The phone call changed everything. The voice was female, young, speaking with that flat effect Dr. Patricia Chen had documented 8 years earlier. No identification, no callback number, just coordinates to a location 15 miles past Blackstone Ridge, deeper into the mountains than any road should go. "Why call me?" Dr. Price asked, pen already moving to write down the location. "Because you study broken brains, and Catherine's brain is breaking. She's seizing. She won't stop. If you don't come, Halton's protocols say we terminate her. She's 17. We don't want to terminate her." What kind of family has protocols for terminating their own children? The coordinates led not to Blackstone Ridge, but to a smaller property, a hunting cabin renovated into a medical facility, generator-powered, with examination rooms and a single hospital bed where a teenage girl lay convulsing. Catherine Harlan, Dr. Price assumed that was her name, though no one confirmed it, was having a grand mal seizure that had already lasted 19 minutes by the time Dr. Price arrived. Status epilepticus. Fatal if not stopped immediately. Around the bed stood 6 Harlan adults, all with those characteristic compressed features, all watching with clinical detachment, as if the girl's suffering was simply data to be observed. "How long has this been happening?" Dr. Price demanded, dropping her medical bag, checking vitals, preparing emergency medications. "Since birth," one of the women answered. "They all seize, some stop, some don't. Catherine's seizures are getting worse, more frequent. Halton said this means her coefficient is too high, that she's a correction failure. He wants us to let her die and try again." Dr. Price injected lorazepam followed by phenytoin, her hands steady despite the surreal horror of the situation. The seizure broke. Catherine's breathing stabilized. Her eyes opened, amber-toned, unfocused, but aware. "She needs a hospital," Dr. Price said. "Imaging, proper monitoring, medication management." "No hospitals." The male Harlan who spoke, maybe 40, maybe 60, aging was impossible to determine, stepped closer. "You examine her here. You tell us what's wrong with her genetics. You tell us if she's viable." When did a teenage girl become something to be evaluated for viability, like livestock or lab specimens? Dr. Price demanded medical records. What she received instead was a leather-bound journal, handwritten in mix of English and German, documenting Catherine's entire medical history from conception through current day. Birth weight, developmental milestones, seizure frequency, medications administered, and notations in the margins. Subject displays acceptable cognitive function despite coefficient 0.43, viable for breeding purposes if seizures controlled. Recommend continuation of Halton protocols. The journal was signed by Dr. Friedrich Halton, dated as recently as 6 months prior. "Who is Halton?" Dr. Price asked, though she'd already heard the name whispered in medical circles, always in connection with the Harlan case. "Our physician. He's been managing our genetic health since my grandfather's time. He works in Europe now, but he guides us remotely, sends medications, protocols, instructions." When Dr. Price asked to see other family medical records, they brought her 17 journals, one for each living Harlan child, all maintained with the same clinical precision, all signed by Halton, all containing the same disturbing assessments about viability and breeding potential. She spent 3 hours examining Catherine. The girl had severe neurological damage consistent with chronic oxygen deprivation, likely from repeated, untreated seizures over years. Her EEG, Dr. Price had brought a portable unit, showed abnormal wave patterns suggesting structural brain abnormalities. An MRI would reveal more, but Dr. Price knew with certainty. Catherine's condition was genetic, progressive, and directly caused by extreme inbreeding. "She needs anti-epileptic medication daily," Dr. Price told the assembled Harlans. "Hospital-grade monitoring. If she has another seizure this severe, she could suffer permanent brain damage or death." "Will she be able to have children?" one of the women asked. The question hung in the air like poison gas. Not will she survive, not will she recover, but will she breed? "That's not my primary concern right now." "It's our primary concern. Can she continue the bloodline?" Dr. Price felt something cold settle in her chest. These weren't parents worried about their daughter. These were breeders assessing livestock. Catherine was 17 years old, suffering from genetic disorders caused by generations of incest, and her family's only question was whether she could produce more genetically damaged children. Dr. Price lied. Her condition will likely cause fertility issues. She's not viable for reproduction. She gambled that this lie would save Catherine's life. If they thought she couldn't breed, maybe they'd allow her to receive actual medical care rather than being terminated according to Halton's protocols. The Harlans conferred in their private language, low whispers that sounded like wind through stone. Finally, the oldest woman nodded. Then we keep her comfortable. No hospital. You'll provide medication and visit weekly to monitor her condition. We'll pay you in gold like the others. I need her to come to my office. Weekly visits here, or we follow Halton's recommendation and terminate her tonight. Dr. Price agreed. What choice did she have? Call the police. On what grounds? The family was providing medical care, however twisted. Catherine was conscious, not being held against her will technically. And Dr. Price knew with bitter certainty that if she refused or reported them, they'd simply vanish again, and Catherine would die in some basement operating room, her organs preserved in a jar labeled "Subject Failed." Like the Turpin children hidden in plain sight in California, like the victims of Larry Nassar protected by institutions that looked away, Catherine Harlan existed in a gray zone where legal authority ended and family sovereignty began. She was both patient and prisoner, both victim and willing participant in a genetic experiment that had consumed 3 generations. As Dr. Price left the cabin that night, one of the younger Harlan women, maybe 20, pregnant, her belly swollen with what Price estimated was an 8-month fetus, followed her to the car. She pressed something into Dr. Price's hand, a small photograph yellowed with age, showing a man in a white coat standing in front of a European university building. On the back, written in English, Dr. Friedrich Halton, Basel Institute of Genetic Medicine, 1929. He's still alive, the pregnant woman whispered. He visits every 5 years. He examines all the children, the ones who fail his tests. We never see them again. And doctor, her amber eyes caught the moonlight. I'm carrying twins. Edmund and Catherine, we've already named them. And I'm terrified of what happens if they fail. Dr. Price's weekly visits revealed something worse than genetic collapse. The Harlans were documenting their own extinction with scientific precision. Over the next 8 months, from December 1978 through July 1979, Dr. Helena Price became the only outsider to witness the Harlan family's daily existence. Every Tuesday at dusk, she drove those mountain roads to the cabin, medical bag in hand, knowing she was crossing into territory where American law had no jurisdiction and medical ethics existed only as theoretical concepts written in German on yellowed pages. Catherine's condition stabilized under medication, but Dr. Price's real education came from what she observed around the treatment sessions. A family so methodically committed to its own genetic ideology that it had transformed survival itself into a clinical study, with themselves as both researchers and subjects. The pregnant woman who'd given her Halton's photograph, her name was Rebecca, she eventually shared became Dr. Price's guide into the family's reality. Rebecca was 23, pregnant with her 4th set of children, twins this time, triplets before, one singleton who didn't make it past evaluation. She spoke about reproduction the way factory workers discuss quotas. Rebecca kept her own medical journal, separate from Halton's official documentation, written in careful English and hidden under the cabin's floorboards. A secret history of every pregnancy, every birth, every correction, and every child who vanished into Halton's care. Dr. Price read it during one visit when Rebecca excused herself to vomit, morning sickness, combined with the anti-nausea effects of extreme anxiety. The entries painted a portrait of systematic genetic management that would make a livestock breeder proud and a human rights advocate weep. January 1974 delivered boy, 6 pounds 3 oz, webbed fingers, cleft palate, one kidney visible on examination. Halton protocols say terminate. Uncle Marcus performed the procedure. We buried him in the north field. No name given. Subject 31. March 1975 delivered girl, 7 pounds 1 oz. Perfect external features. Halton examined at 3 months, found heart murmur. Said she was marginally viable, kept her. Named Catherine, my third Catherine, she's the one who seizes now. November 1976 delivered twins, both boys. Both showed acceptable features, but one had what Halton called microneural defects visible only on his special scans. That one went to Europe with Halton. We were told he'd be part of advanced genetic therapy studies. We never heard about him again. The other twin is here, named Edmund, seems healthy. So far. How many children had been sent to Europe, to this Halton Institute, for studies that families never witnessed and children never returned from? Rebecca's journal documented 23 pregnancies across the family between 1970 and 1978. 31 children born, several multiple births. 14 kept and raised at the cabin or nearby properties. 8 terminated at birth due to severe defects. 9 sent to Europe with Halton. 9 children shipped across the Atlantic like medical specimens, which is exactly what they were to Halton. Dr. Price felt sick reading it, understanding with horrible clarity that she was witnessing the tail end of a genetic experiment that spanned decades, crossed continents, and consumed children as raw material for eugenic research. Why do you let him take them? Dr. Price asked Rebecca when she returned, her face pale, her pregnant belly enormous under a dress stitched from feed sacks. Rebecca's answer was simple and devastating. Because he promised that if we follow the protocols, eventually our bloodline will stabilize, the defects will breed out, will be pure again like Edmund intended. And Dr. Price, Rebecca placed a hand on her swollen abdomen. I've had 7 pregnancies. I've kept 3 children. I can't do this forever. My body is breaking. All of us women, we're breaking. We need Halton to be right. We need the corrections to work. Otherwise, all of this suffering means nothing. Dr. Price examined 5 other Harlan women during those months and discovered what Rebecca meant by breaking. All showed signs of reproductive trauma, scarring, prolapsed organs, bone density loss, and complications consistent with multiple pregnancies occurring too close together in bodies already compromised by genetic abnormalities. These women weren't just bearers of a bloodline. They were being used up, their bodies treated as breeding vessels in service of an ideology that viewed genetic purity as worth any human cost. The oldest, a woman named Sarah, the same Sarah who delivered at Charleston Memorial in 1970, was only 41 but looked 60, her spine curved from osteoporosis, her teeth falling out from calcium depletion, her uterus so damaged from repeated pregnancies and amateur surgical interventions that Dr. Price privately doubted she'd survive another birth. How many more pregnancies are planned? Dr. Price asked during one examination, trying to keep judgment from her voice. Until the bloodline stabilizes, Sarah answered, as if this explained everything. Halton says we're close. Maybe 2 more generations. My daughters will see it. The perfection Edmund promised. In March 1979, Dr. Price discovered the family maintained detailed genealogical charts going back to 1920, mapping not just relationships but genetic markers, defect frequencies, and improvement trends, essentially treating their own reproduction like a controlled breeding experiment in agricultural science. The charts hung on the cabin's back room wall, covered by a sheet that someone forgot to replace after a family meeting. Dr. Price studied them while Catherine slept off her post-seizure exhaustion. The complexity rivaled anything she'd seen in genetics labs: color-coded lines tracking traits, mathematical notations calculating coefficients, predictions about future generation improvements. At the bottom, in Halton's handwriting dated November 1978, Generation 7 projection, coefficient stable at 0.44, defect rate declining 12% per generation, fertility issues increasing but manageable with supplementation, neurological complications persistent but non-lethal in 73% of cases. Conclusion: the Harlan line is approaching genetic equilibrium. 20 more viable births required for conclusive data. Continue protocols. 20 more births. 20 more children entering this system of evaluation, correction, and potential termination. 20 more chances for failed bobbies to be sent to Europe or buried in unmarked graves in the North Field. Like the Lebensborn program that bred racially pure children for Nazi Germany, like the forced sterilization of undesirables in American eugenics programs, like the Tuskegee experiments that treated black bodies as research material. The Harlan breeding program revealed how easily science becomes cruelty when ideology replaces ethics. But in July 1979, everything changed. Dr. Price arrived for her weekly visit to find the cabin empty, not abandoned, but evacuated. Medical equipment gone, personal belongings removed. Only Rebecca's hidden journal remained under the floorboards with one final entry dated that morning. Halton called emergency protocol. Someone found the fire evidence from 1973. Investigators are coming. We're moving to the secondary location. Dr. Price, if you read this, please understand, we're not monsters. We're just trying to save our family the only way we know how. The address in Basel is real. If you want the truth about where the children go, that's where you'll find it. But I don't think you want that truth. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. R.H. Dr. Price flew to Basel in August 1979 and discovered the Halton Institute wasn't hidden in shadows. It operated openly with government funding and academic prestige. The address Rebecca had left led to a 6-story research facility in Basel's University District, modern glass and steel gleaming in the Swiss sunlight. A brass plaque by the entrance read, Halton Institute for Genetic Medicine, S. 1952, Advancing Human Health Through Hereditary Science. Not a secret basement laboratory, not a Gothic horror set piece. A legitimate research institution with published papers, grant funding, and academic partnerships with universities across Europe. Dr. Price stood on the sidewalk, briefcase in hand, feeling reality tilt sideways. She'd expected to find evidence of criminal activity. Instead, she found respectability. The receptionist spoke perfect English and smiled warmly when Dr. Price introduced herself as an American neurologist interested in hereditary seizure disorders. Dr. Halton is semi-retired but maintains office hours Tuesdays and Thursdays. Would you like to schedule a consultation? How does a man who's been conducting illegal genetic experiments on an American family for 40 years operate openly as a respected researcher in Europe? Dr. Friedrich Halton, age 76, met with Dr. Price that same afternoon. and showed her his curriculum vitae spanning 5 decades of genetic research, including a 1975 UNESCO award for contributions to understanding hereditary disease prevention. He was grandfatherly, charming, offering Swiss chocolate and tea in a book-lined office decorated with family photographs, his own grandchildren. He noted warmly, and framed academic credentials from institutions Dr. Price recognized. Heidelberg, Cambridge, Johns Hopkins, visiting professor, 1968-1969. "You're here about the Harlan family," Halton said, not as a question but as an observation, his English carrying only the slightest German accent. "I wondered when someone would trace the connection. Please sit. I'm happy to discuss my work." His work, not his crimes, his work. Dr. Price sat, trying to reconcile this grandfatherly academic with a man whose signature appeared on documents ordering infant terminations and child disappearances. "You've been managing their breeding program since the 1930s. "Managing their genetic health," Halton corrected gently. "There's a distinction. The Harlans came to me, well, Edmund did initially, seeking medical guidance for a family facing severe consanguinity challenges. I've provided that guidance for 4 decades, all within the bounds of medical ethics as understood at the time. At the time, you were ordering the termination of bobbies with correctable defects. I was preventing suffering." Halton's voice remained calm, almost professorial. "Dr. Price, you're a neurologist. You understand genetic cascades. The Harlan coefficient of inbreeding reached zero point 0.4 by 1950. Without intervention, that entire bloodline would have collapsed within 2 generations. Every child born with severe defects, most dead by age 5, the survivors unable to reproduce. I saved that family." Halton opened a filing cabinet and showed Dr. Price his published research, peer-reviewed papers in respected journals documenting genetic rescue in isolated populations, with data clearly drawn from the Harlan family but anonymized as Population H, North American Cohort. The papers were real, published in Nature, the Lancet, American Journal of Human Genetics, co-authored with researchers from prestigious institutions, cited hundreds of times by other geneticists studying inbreeding depression, population bottlenecks, and genetic disease prevention. "You used them as research subjects without informed consent," Dr. Price said, her voice shaking. "They asked to be research subjects," Halton countered. "Edmund understood his family's predicament. He knew they needed scientific intervention. He volunteered his entire bloodline for study in exchange for medical management that would preserve their genetic continuity. I have signed consent documents dating to 1936. He produced them, legal agreements, notarized, showing Edmund Harlan granting Dr. Friedrich Halton full medical authority over all hereditary health matters pertaining to the Harlan family line, including but not limited to reproductive counseling, genetic testing, and therapeutic interventions. The language was broad enough to encompass everything Halton had done: the terminations, the corrections, the children sent to Europe. If consent was given, if the family volunteered, if the research produced legitimate scientific knowledge, was it still a crime? Dr. Price felt nauseated. "The children you took to Europe, where are they?" Halton sipped his tea. "Most are here at the Institute, in our long-term care facility. Children with severe genetic conditions requiring specialized treatment that couldn't be provided in rural West Virginia. We've kept them comfortable, provided therapy, advanced their care as medical knowledge improved. Would you like to meet them?" The long-term care facility, occupied the Institute's entire fourth floor, a specialized medical ward housing 11 individuals ranging from age 6 to 23, all with severe disabilities resulting from extreme inbreeding, all receiving state-funded care under Swiss medical welfare programs. Halton led Dr. Price through sterile white hallways lined with rooms where children, some still children, some now adults, lived with round-the-clock nursing care. Wheelchairs, feeding tubes, specialized equipment for individuals with profound neurological and physical disabilities. The care was immaculate. The facilities were modern. The staff was compassionate. And every single person in those rooms had amber-toned eyes and compressed facial features that marked them as Harlan Bloodline. "They're alive," Halton said softly, pausing by a window overlooking Basel's skyline. "Without my intervention, they would have died in basement operating rooms in West Virginia, their bodies disposed of in unmarked graves. Instead, they receive professional medical care in a country with robust disability support systems. I saved them, Dr. Price. Just as I saved the viable Harlan children by ensuring the genetic line could continue." Dr. Price stared at a young woman, maybe 19, nonverbal, her body twisted by genetic disorders, being fed lunch by a patient nurse who spoke to her gently in German. The woman smiled, a crooked, genuine smile, at something the nurse said. "The ones who died," Dr. Price forced herself to ask, "the terminated infants, the corrections?" "Would have suffered briefly and died anyway," Halton answered. "I simply prevented prolonged suffering. Infant euthanasia for severe genetic defects was, and in some nations still is, considered medically ethical when performed to prevent intractable suffering. The Harlans understood this. They consented to protocols that prioritized quality of life over quantity of life. Like the T4 program in Nazi Germany that killed disabled individuals under the guise of mercy. Like modern debates about genetic screening and selective termination. Like the Peter Singer arguments for infanticide in cases of severe disability. Halton had wrapped eugenic ideology in the language of compassion and medical necessity. And he'd done it with paperwork, consent forms, and academic credentials that made prosecution nearly impossible. As Dr. Price prepared to leave, Halton handed her a business card. "The Harlans will contact you again. They've moved to a new location, I can't tell you where, patient confidentiality, but they'll need ongoing medical support. When they call, please help them. Their genetic stabilization is a scientific triumph worth preserving." He paused, his elderly face kind, grandfatherly. "And Dr. Price, you'll find that American authorities have no interest in prosecuting what happened. I've already been contacted by your FBI and your State Department. They've reviewed my research. They understand its value. Some doors, as Rebecca told you, are better left closed." He smiled. "Besides, you're looking at this wrong. Those 11 people upstairs, they're alive because of me. The 19 healthy Harlan children, they exist because of my protocols. I didn't destroy a family. I saved one. History will judge me accordingly." Dr. Price returned to West Virginia and found FBI agents already at her office. Not to investigate Halton, but to investigate her for violating patient confidentiality. The two men in dark suits introduced themselves as Special Agents Crawford and Mitchell, Department of Justice, presenting credentials and a polite but firm request that Dr. Price accompany them to the Charleston Federal Building for a discussion regarding your recent travel to Switzerland and your involvement with a sensitive genetic research matter. Sensitive genetic research matter, not criminal investigation, not human rights violation. Research matter. Dr. Price sat across a gray metal table in an interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional anxiety, trying to understand how she'd become the subject of federal scrutiny, instead of the man who'd orchestrated 4 decades of eugenic experimentation on American citizens. Agent Crawford opened a file folder containing photographs. Dr. Price entering the Halton Institute. Dr. Price speaking with Halton in his office. Dr. Price touring the fourth-floor care facility. Someone had documented her entire Basel visit. You accessed private medical records without authorization, Crawford said, his tone neutral. You photographed confidential patient information. You removed documents from a foreign research facility without permission. The FBI wasn't investigating the Harlan family's genetic program. They'd been monitoring it since 1974, when Chief Cross's fire report first surfaced, and had decided the research had significant national security implications worth preserving. Agent Mitchell slid another document across the table, a declassified memo from 1975, stamped "Confidential Eyes Only," summarizing the Harlan case as an unprecedented opportunity to study multi-generational inbreeding effects in a controlled Western population without government expenditure or ethical oversight complications. The memo, signed by someone whose name was redacted, continued. Dr. Halton's methodology, while ethically questionable by current standards, provides invaluable genetic data relevant to population survival scenarios, nuclear fallout, isolated colony establishment, long-term space habitation. Recommend non-interference approach with periodic monitoring. The Harlan family's voluntary participation and isolation eliminate risk of public exposure or humanitarian advocacy complications. Dr. Price read it twice, her hands shaking. You've been letting this happen. For 5 years you've known. We've been documenting naturally occurring research, Crawford interrupted. No federal laws were broken. The Harlans are American citizens exercising their right to choose their own medical care. Dr. Halton is a foreign national operating legally in Switzerland. His published research has contributed to scientific understanding of genetic diseases affecting thousands of people worldwide. At what point does scientific value outweigh human suffering? Who decides when knowledge matters more than the people it's extracted from? Agent Mitchell leaned forward. Dr. Price, we're not here to debate ethics. We're here because you violated federal law by accessing protected health information and attempting to remove medical records from a foreign facility. That's a felony. You could face criminal charges. Unless, Dr. Price asked, recognizing the shape of what was coming. Unless you agree to a non-disclosure agreement regarding everything you witnessed in Basel and everything you know about the Harlan family medical situation. You'll sign documents stating you will not publish, discuss, or in any way publicly disclose information related to this matter. In exchange, no charges will be filed, and you'll be free to continue your medical practice. The NDA they presented was 23 pages long, legally binding for her lifetime, with penalties including imprisonment and forfeiture of medical license for any violation. And it had already been signed by Dr. Patricia Chen, Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief Daniel Cross, and 17 other individuals who'd encountered the Harlan family over the decades. They'd all been silenced. Every witness, every concerned professional, every person who'd glimpsed the truth had been wrapped in federal legal constraints that transformed moral outrage into criminal liability. What about the children? Dr. Price asked, her voice hollow. Catherine, the one having seizures, Rebecca's twins who were born by now, the family still living in those mountains. They're receiving appropriate medical care through channels Dr. Halton has established, Crawford said. Multiple physicians are now involved in their treatment, all operating under legal medical practice guidelines. The family is stable. The genetic situation is being managed. Your involvement is no longer necessary or appropriate. You're protecting him, protecting Halton. We're protecting valuable research, Mitchell corrected, and preventing an international incident with Switzerland over a scientist who's broken no Swiss laws and whose work has legitimate scientific merit. Dr. Halton has already agreed to share his Harlan family data with the National Institutes of Health for analysis. That data will inform genetic counseling protocols for isolated populations worldwide. Real people will benefit from this knowledge. If the knowledge saves lives in the future, does it justify the suffering that created it? Can stolen fruit still feed the hungry? Dr. Price thought about the 11 people on that Basel fourth floor. Alive, yes. Comfortable, yes. But existing as living data points in an experiment they never chose to be part of. Their bodies and minds shaped by ideologies that viewed genetic purity as worth any human cost. She thought about Rebecca's twins, born into a system that would evaluate them for viability, measure their coefficient of inbreeding, determine whether they were acceptable contributions to the bloodline or failures requiring correction. She thought about Catherine, seizing in that mountain cabin, her family's only concern whether she could still breed. Dr. Price signed the NDA, not because she agreed with it, not because she thought it was right, but because she understood with crushing clarity that fighting it would accomplish nothing except her own destruction, while the Harlan family would continue exactly as before, monitored, documented, and protected by federal authorities who decided their suffering had research value. The agents witnessed her signature, provided her with a copy, and stood to leave. At the door, Crawford turned back. "One more thing, Doctor. The Harlan family will likely contact you again for medical care. If they do, you're free to provide it. In fact, we'd encourage it. Just remember your obligations under the agreement." He tapped the folder. "We'll be watching." Like Operation Paperclip bringing Nazi scientists to America, like the Tuskegee experiments continuing until journalists exposed them, like MK Ultra's mind control research operating for decades with government funding. The Harlan case revealed how easily atrocity becomes acceptable when wrapped in scientific justification and national security classifications. The crime wasn't committed by rogue actors. The crime was the system protecting itself. But Dr. Price had photographed one document in Basel that she didn't tell the FBI about, hidden in her apartment now in a hollowed-out medical textbook. Halton's handwritten notes from 1978 mentioning Phase 2 initiation, American family stabilized, European expansion ready. Contact families, Whitmore, Kentucky, Ashford, Tennessee, Kessler, Pennsylvania. Offer same protocols, build network. The Harlans weren't the only family. They were just the first. And somewhere in 3 more states, Halton's genetic experiment was spreading, protected by silence, consent forms, and federal agencies that had decided some suffering was worth the data it produced. Bound by silence, Dr. Price could only watch as the Harlans emerged from hiding in 1982, not as victims, but as advocates for genetic sovereignty rights. The first public appearance happened at a regional genetics conference in Lexington, Kentucky. Dr. Price attended, as she did most professional conferences, trying to maintain normalcy in a career now shadowed by federal monitoring and enforced silence. She was reviewing a poster presentation on hereditary seizure disorders when she heard a voice she recognized. Flat affect, carefully enunciated English, that distinctive Harlan speech pattern. Rebecca Harlan stood at a microphone during the open forum session, no longer the frightened pregnant woman from the mountain cabin. She wore professional clothing, her hair styled, her posture confident. Beside her stood three other Harlan adults, all presenting a united front that looked almost rehearsed. My name is Rebecca Harlan, and I'm here to speak about families like mine who have been stigmatized by mainstream medicine for exercising our right to genetic self-determination. Rebecca delivered a 15-minute presentation arguing that isolated families practicing endogamy, marriage within the family group, should have legal protection as a form of cultural and genetic heritage preservation, comparing their situation to indigenous populations maintaining traditional practices. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence as Rebecca, reading from prepared notes that Dr. Price suspected were written by someone with legal training, outlined a vision of genetic sovereignty, where families could make reproductive decisions without government interference, choose their own medical protocols, and preserve bloodlines they viewed as culturally significant. For 3 generations, my family has been pathologized, investigated, and treated as criminals for maintaining traditions that harm no one outside our family unit. We've been called victims. We've been called experiments. But we're neither. Rebecca's amber eyes scanned the audience. We're American citizens making informed choices about our own bodies and our own bloodlines. And we're not alone. When does cultural autonomy become justification for genetic harm? Where's the line between self-determination and self-destruction? Dr. Price felt sick. This wasn't a victim speaking. This was propaganda, carefully constructed rhetoric designed to reframe decades of suffering as an exercise in civil rights. And the worst part, some audience members were nodding. A geneticist from Ohio raised his hand. What about the health consequences? Inbreeding depression, genetic disorders, increased infant mortality. Rebecca smiled, that same crooked smile Dr. Price remembered but now weaponized. What about them? Families with hereditary genetic conditions have the right to reproduce despite risks. Why should we be different? Because we're honest about keeping bloodlines concentrated rather than diluted. Our family works with qualified physicians. We monitor health outcomes. We make informed decisions. That's all any family does. After the presentation, Rebecca approached Dr. Price directly, in full view of other attendees, and thanked her for the compassionate care you provided our family during a difficult time, deliberately creating a public record of Dr. Price's involvement that would make any future testimony against the family legally complicated. "How are you?" Dr. Price asked carefully, aware they were being watched, her NDA constraining every word. "Thriving," Rebecca answered. "My twins are 4 now, healthy, bright, beautiful. The protocols worked, Dr. Price. Everything Dr. Halton promised came true. Our family is stable. The genetic line is viable. And now we're helping other families achieve the same success." Other families. The words hung in the air like a chemical smell. Dr. Price remembered the document she'd hidden. Whitmore, Ashford, Kessler. Families in Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania. "You've expanded," Dr. Price said, not quite a question. "We've connected," Rebecca corrected. "There are more families like ours than you'd think. Isolated communities, generational endogamy facing the same medical challenges. Dr. Halton has developed protocols that can help them too. We're building a network, a support system, Legal advocacy for genetic sovereignty rights. Rebecca handed Dr. Price a business card for something called the Heritage Genetics Advocacy Network, a nonprofit organization established in 1981 with a Philadelphia address, board members including 2 lawyers and a bioethicist, and mission statement promoting the rights of isolated populations to maintain genetic heritage through informed reproductive autonomy. It was real, incorporated, legally recognized. The Harlan genetic experiment had transformed into a movement, complete with nonprofit status, legal framework, and academic-sounding mission statements that masked what was actually being advocated: the right to systematic inbreeding without government interference. "You're normalizing this," Dr. Price whispered, horror overwhelming caution. "We're defending this," Rebecca whispered back. "And we have allies now. Researchers who see the scientific value, lawyers who see the civil rights implications, ethicists who believe in bodily autonomy and family sovereignty. You'd be surprised how many people support genetic self-determination when you frame it properly." Dr. Price wanted to scream, wanted to grab Rebecca and shake her and demand she acknowledge the suffering, the failed bobbies, the women's bodies breaking, the children sent away, Catherine seizing alone in that cabin. But she was bound legally, federally, irrevocably to silence. If victims reframe their own oppression as freedom, does that make it less oppressive, or just more insidious? Over the next 3 years, Dr. Price watched the Heritage Genetics Advocacy Network grow. Conference presentations at medical and legal symposiums, opinion pieces in bioethics journals, a 1984 court case in Pennsylvania where the Kessler family successfully fought Child Protective Services, arguing that their multi-generational cousin marriages were protected under religious freedom and parental rights doctrines. The Kesslers won. By 1985, the network had documented 23 families across 6 states practicing various forms of endogamy, all receiving medical support through Halton's protocols, all arguing for legal recognition of genetic heritage preservation as a protected cultural practice. And mainstream bioethicists were actually debating whether they had a point. Arguments appeared in academic papers. If we allow genetic screening to eliminate disabled fetuses, why prohibit choices that might create genetic risk? If we support reproductive autonomy, can we only support autonomy for choices we approve of? If indigenous communities maintain traditional marriage practices despite genetic risks, why treat isolated American families differently? The Harlans had found the perfect legal and ethical gray zone, the space where bodily autonomy meets cultural preservation, meets genetic risk, and they were weaponizing ambiguity to protect a system that consumed children and called it sovereignty. Like modern voluntary cults that use consent as a shield, like contemporary debates about genetic editing and designer bobbies, like the persistent arguments for racial preservation, dressed in cultural autonomy language. The Harlan advocacy movement revealed how easily horror adapts when it learns to speak the language of rights, freedom, and self-determination. But in 1985, Dr. Price received an unmarked envelope at her home containing a single photograph. Catherine Harlan, now 24, standing in front of the Basel Institute, very pregnant, wearing a white patient gown, her expression vacant. Written on the back in Rebecca's handwriting, "Catherine proved viable after all. She's carrying Edmund's genetic line now. Dr. Halton says this generation will finally be pure. You were wrong to doubt us. Some families are worth saving, no matter the cost. And Dr. Price, we're nomming your name in our next conference presentation, crediting you as one of the compassionate physicians who understood our rights. You're part of this now, whether you accept it or not. Welcome to the heritage. In 1988, a journalist named Thomas Garrett began investigating the Heritage Network, and his car went off a mountain road 3 weeks later. His notes burned in the wreckage. Thomas Garrett was an investigative reporter for the Charleston Gazette, 34 years old, married with 2 kids, known for tenacious reporting on Appalachian corruption and environmental scandals. He'd won a Regional Journalism Award in 1986 for exposing coal company fraud. He was careful, methodical, and not prone to conspiracy thinking. His interest in the Heritage Genetics Advocacy Network began with a routine assignment, a puff piece on nonprofit organizations serving rural communities. The Heritage Network appeared on his list. Their website, one of the first nonprofit websites in West Virginia, actually presented them as a genetic counseling service helping isolated families manage hereditary health risks. Thomas scheduled an interview with their regional coordinator, Rebecca Harlan. Dr. Price learned about Thomas 3 days after their interview, when he called her office requesting comment on her involvement with families practicing multi-generational endogamy. Her secretary took the message. Dr. Price didn't return the call, couldn't return it, bound by federal NDA, but she felt a chill of recognition. Someone was finally asking questions. Thomas's preliminary research, preserved in his editor's files after his death, revealed he'd found hospital records showing unusual patterns. 17 births across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Pennsylvania between 1981-987, with genetic markers consistent with extreme inbreeding, all linked to families in the Heritage Network, all delivered by physicians receiving consulting fees from a Swiss medical research foundation. He'd connected dots that were supposed to stay disconnected. He'd found the paper trail linking Halton's Institute to American families, money flowing from Basel to regional physicians, medical conferences where Heritage Network members presented their success stories to sympathetic bioethicists. Thomas's notes, partially recovered from the crash site, posed questions that indicated he understood what he was looking at. How is this legal? Who's funding the medical care? Why are federal agencies not investigating? What happened to children listed as transferred to long-term care? Connection to Dr. Friedrich Halton, Nazi-era geneticist, same person. He'd scheduled interviews with 3 more families in the network. He'd requested FBI files under Freedom of Information Act. He'd contacted a human rights lawyer in Philadelphia who specialized in cases involving isolated religious communities. How do you silence a journalist in 1988 and make it look like an accident? And who had the resources and motivation to do it? The accident report seemed straightforward. Thomas Garrett's vehicle, a 1985 Honda Accord, left Route 60 near Hawks Nest on the evening of October 12, 1988. The road was wet, visibility poor, curves sharp. His car went through a guardrail, rolled 300 feet down a mountainside, and caught fire on impact. Thomas died instantly from blunt force trauma. The state police ruled it accidental death, driver error, speed inappropriate for conditions, tragic but not suspicious. Except Thomas's wife, Margaret, told anyone who'd listen, very few would, that her husband was an obsessively cautious driver who'd driven that road hundreds of times. That he'd called her 2 hours before the crash saying he'd found something bigger than I thought, something protected at federal level. That he was bringing his notes home, planning to contact the Washington Post because local papers can't touch this. The notes burned in the fire. Thomas's tape recordings of interviews he always recorded were never recovered. His office files were seized by FBI agents the morning after his death, citing ongoing federal investigation into matters of national security. Files his editor was told would be returned after review, but never were. Margaret Garrett received a visit from two men in suits 3 days after the funeral, not to offer condolences, but to present her with a legal settlement. $250,000 in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement about her late husband's work and agreeing not to pursue any further investigation into his death. She refused initially. Then her children's school received bomb threats. Her employer, a local accounting firm, suddenly discovered budget issues requiring her position be eliminated. Her car was broken into twice in 1 week. Nothing stolen, but everything ransacked. She signed the NDA within a month. Dr. Price only learned these details years later, after Margaret Garrett violated her own NDA by sending anonymous letters to medical ethics boards, journalists, and anyone she thought might care. The letters were ignored, dismissed as grief-induced conspiracy theories, or, in several cases, resulted in FBI visits to the recipients warning them about disseminating classified information. Margaret's letter to Dr. Price, received in January 1989, included one detail that made Dr. Price's blood freeze. Thomas's last interview was with a teenage girl from the Whitmore family in Kentucky. She told him about corrections performed on her newborn sister, surgery done at the family's property by someone she called the German doctor. Thomas said he was going to track down this doctor, find out who he really was. 2 days later, my husband was dead. Dr. Price, how many people has this network killed to protect itself? And how many more will die before someone with power decides to care? Dr. Price hired a private investigator to look into Thomas Garrett's crash paying cash, using a false name, covering her tracks. The investigator, a former state police officer named Jack Morrison, found something the official report missed: brake line damage consistent with deliberate cutting, visible in crash scene photos but never mentioned in the accident analysis. Jack Morrison prepared a supplementary report documenting his findings, estimated Thomas's brake lines were severed sometime in the 6 hours before his death, and concluded the crash was probable homicide disguised as accident. He delivered the report to Dr. Price on a Tuesday afternoon in March 1989. He was found dead of an apparent heart attack in his office that Friday. Age 52, no previous cardiac history, medical examiner ruled natural causes. His files on the Garrett case disappeared before his secretary could inventory them. Dr. Price understood then with absolute clarity. The Heritage Network wasn't just protected by federal NDAs and legal frameworks. It was protected by something darker, more ruthless. People who asked too many questions died in ways that looked natural or accidental, and no one with actual power was willing to investigate because the network had been declared valuable research, national security interest, worth protecting at any cost. Like journalists who died investigating CIA operations, like witnesses who disappeared before testifying against organized crime, like whistleblowers who suffered accidents. After exposing corporate malfeasance, Thomas Garrett and Jack Morrison joined the ranks of people killed for knowing too much and caring too much about truth that powerful entities wanted buried. But Thomas Garrett had done one thing his killers didn't know about. 2 weeks before his death, he'd mailed copies of all his research to his college roommate David Chen, who happened to be a federal prosecutor in Washington, D.C., The package included photographs, interview transcripts, financial records linking Halton's institute to the Heritage Network, and a note. Dave, if something happens to me, this is why. Don't let them bury it. David Chen received the package 3 days after Thomas's funeral. He read it. He understood what he was holding, and he faced the same choice Dr. Price had faced. Fight a system designed to destroy anyone who challenged it, or protect himself and his family by becoming another keeper of terrible secrets. In 1989, David Chen made his choice. He locked Thomas's research in a safe deposit box and tried to forget it existed. But some boxes, once opened in the mind, can never be fully closed again. By 1992, the Heritage Network operated in 12 states with over 60 families, and Dr. Halton published a book celebrating them as humanity's genetic future. The book was titled Genetic Sovereignty: Preserving Bloodlines in the Modern Age, published by a respected academic press out of Cambridge, Massachusetts. It featured a foreword by a prominent bioethicist from Princeton and back cover endorsements from 3 geneticists whose names Dr. Price recognized from major research institutions. Dr. Halton, now 89 years old but still active, had written what reviewers called a provocative exploration of reproductive autonomy and genetic heritage preservation. The book argued, in dense academic prose wrapped around carefully selected data, that isolated populations practicing endogamy could maintain genetic viability through proper medical management and selective intervention. The Heritage Network families were his proof, anonymized as population groups A through F, but Dr. Price recognized the data. Birth rates, infant mortality, genetic disorder frequencies, all presented to show improving trends over successive generations, thanks to Halton's protocols. The book never mentioned the basement operating rooms, never mentioned the 28 corrected children, never mentioned Thomas Garrett or Jack Morrison or any of the people who died asking questions. The book became required reading in several university bioethics programs, praised for challenging conventional assumptions about genetic diversity and raising important questions about cultural autonomy in reproductive decision-making. Dr. Price attended a lecture where a young ethics professor presented Halton's work as an example of morally complex cases where traditional bioethical frameworks struggle to provide clear answers. The students debated whether genetic sovereignty was a legitimate extension of bodily autonomy or a dangerous justification for eugenic practices. Most sided with Halton. If we support a woman's right to choose abortion despite genetic abnormalities, one student argued, doesn't consistency require we support her right to choose pregnancy despite genetic risks? Who are we to judge? The professor nodded approvingly. Exactly the kind of nuanced thinking we need. There are no easy answers here. When academic discourse becomes a shield for atrocity, who bears responsibility? The perpetrator who speaks the language of scholarship, or the scholars who legitimize him? Dr. Price wanted to stand up and scream, wanted to tell them about Catherine's seizing in that mountain cabin, about Rebecca's journal documenting 23 pregnancies and 14 living children, about the jars of infant organs in that Basel basement, about Thomas Garrett's brake lines cut on a mountain road. But her NDA forbade it, and who would believe her anyway? She was one traumatized doctor with no evidence, and a story that sounded like conspiracy theory. Halton had published peer-reviewed research, won international awards, built a legitimate academic reputation over 60 years. By 1992, The Heritage Network had expanded beyond anything Dr. Price had imagined. 63 families across 12 states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, Missouri, Indiana, Alabama, and Georgia, all practicing various forms of endogamy, cousin marriages, uncle-niece unions, in some extreme cases father-daughter relationships legally classified as guardianship with reproductive consent. The network had developed a sophisticated support infrastructure, traveling physicians who rotated between families providing prenatal care and delivery services, a legal defense fund with 3 full-time lawyers, a genetic counseling program training family members in basic hereditary science, and a lobbying arm pushing for genetic heritage protection legislation in state capitals. In 1991, they'd successfully lobbied Tennessee to pass a law exempting culturally isolated populations with documented multi-generational endogamy practices from standard genetic counseling requirements before issuing marriage licenses to close relatives. The law was narrowly written, affecting maybe 200 people statewide, and passed with almost no opposition because nobody understood what it actually protected. Similar laws were pending in 3 other states. The Heritage Network had also established connections with fundamentalist religious communities, Mennonites, traditional Amish, isolated Baptist congregations, who practiced cousin marriage for religious reasons. By aligning with these groups, the network gained religious freedom protections and a broader base of political support. Dr. Halton's Institute in Basel had received $1.2 million in research grants between 1985 and 1992 from American sources. 2 private foundations, 1 pharmaceutical company interested in genetic disease research, and 1 anonymous donor later revealed to be a tech billionaire interested in human longevity through genetic optimization. The money funded expanded facilities, additional researchers, and a new wing devoted to genetic rescue protocols. Essentially, advanced medical interventions for populations affected by inbreeding depression. The research was published, cited, incorporated into mainstream genetic science. Dr. Price read one paper in Nature Genetics that presented data clearly derived from Heritage Network families, improvement in infant survival rates, declining frequency of severe genetic disorders, successful management of hereditary conditions through early intervention. The paper concluded, these findings suggest that with appropriate medical management, isolated populations can maintain genetic stability despite high coefficients of inbreeding, challenging assumptions about the inevitability of genetic collapse in endogamous populations. It was true. The data was real. The Harlans had stabilized. So had the other families. Halton's protocols worked, in the narrow sense of allowing genetically compromised bloodlines to continue reproducing without immediate collapse. Does scientific success erase ethical failure? If the experiment works, does that retroactively justify the suffering it caused? Dr. Price attended a Heritage Network conference in 1992, not as a supporter, but because she needed to witness what they'd become. 200 attendees filled a hotel ballroom in Louisville. Family members, sympathetic physicians, bioethicists, lawyers, and several journalists covering it as a human interest story about families fighting for reproductive rights. Rebecca Harlan, now 43 but looking 60, the genetic toll still visible despite medical management, gave the keynote address. She spoke about generational trauma of being pathologized, about reclaiming our right to genetic self-determination, about building a future where diversity includes the diversity of family structures. She never mentioned the children who died, never mentioned the ones sent away, never mentioned the women whose bodies broke producing the next generation. At the conference, Dr. Price met 7 children from Heritage Network families, teenagers and young adults, all second or third generation born under Halton's protocols, and they were, objectively, healthier than their parents had been. Fewer visible deformities, better cognitive function, reduced seizure frequency. One girl, 15 years old from the Whitmore family in Kentucky, played piano beautifully during the evening reception. Her grandmother had been unable to speak. Her mother had severe learning disabilities. But this girl was bright, articulate musically. Talented, still showing subtle markers of consanguinity in facial structure, still requiring medication for a heart murmur, but functional in ways previous generations weren't. "See," Rebecca said, standing beside Dr. Price as they watched the girl play. "It worked. Everything Edmund believed, everything Dr. Halton promised, it worked. This generation will have children too. The bloodlines will continue, and they'll be stronger than we were." "At what cost?" Dr. Price whispered. Rebecca turned to her, and for the first time in years, Dr. Price saw something other than programmed confidence in her eyes. She saw exhaustion, grief, the weight of counting the cost even while defending it. "The same cost every generation pays," Rebecca answered quietly. "Some die so others can live. Some suffer so others can thrive. That's not unique to us. That's history. We're just honest about it." Like the Manhattan Project scientists who built weapons that incinerated cities, like doctors who developed vaccines through ethically questionable experiments, like every advancement built on suffering justified retroactively by success, the Heritage Network embodied a terrible question. When does the end justify the means? And who gets to decide? But at the conference, Dr. Price overheard 2 lawyers discussing something that chilled her. Phase 3 rollout begins next year. International expansion. Halton's made connections in Russia, Brazil, and Indonesia, isolated populations facing similar issues, willing to implement the protocols. By 2000, he wants a global network. Genetic sovereignty as a human rights framework, protected by international law. One lawyer smiled. "Think about it. Every isolated population worldwide, every community practicing endogamy, all connected, all sharing medical support and legal protection. We're not just saving families anymore. We're building a movement that could reshape how the world thinks about genetic diversity, reproductive rights, and family autonomy." Edmund Harlan's vision, but global. And somewhere in Basel, Dr. Friedrich Halton, now 90 years old, was preparing to export his American experiment to every continent, protected by academic legitimacy, funded by wealthy benefactors, and defended by an entire intellectual framework that had learned to call eugenic control genetic sovereignty. In 1995, Catherine Harlan, the seizing girl Dr. Price had saved, stood before a Senate subcommittee and testified that her family's genetic practices should be federally protected as indigenous cultural heritage. Catherine was 32 now, her body ravaged by decades of poorly controlled epilepsy, her face showing the characteristic compression that marked all Harlan descendants. She walked with a cane, her movements careful, deliberate. But her mind, damaged but not destroyed, had been trained for this moment. She'd memorized testimony written by Heritage Network lawyers, rehearsed inflections and pauses, learned to speak like a victim demanding rights rather than a victim asking for rescue. The Senate Subcommittee on Health and Human Services had convened to examine medical access in isolated communities. A broadly defined hearing that Heritage Network lobbyists had spent 2 years engineering. Senator Patricia Keene from West Virginia, facing re-election and desperate for any positive rural constituent story, had agreed to include Heritage Network representatives. Catherine sat at the witness table, microphone adjusted for her height, cameras broadcasting to C-SPAN's minimal afternoon audience. Dr. Price watched from her living room, feeling like she was witnessing a nightmare given official governmental sanction. Catherine's testimony, delivered in that flat Harlan affect but clearly scripted, argued that families like hers represented a unique American genetic heritage, equivalent to indigenous populations, deserving the same cultural sovereignty protections afforded to Native American tribes and religious communities. My family has maintained our bloodline for 4 generations, Catherine read, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. We've faced discrimination, investigation, and persecution for choices that harm no one outside our family unit. We practice informed consent. We work with qualified physicians. We accept the medical realities of our decisions. But we refuse to accept that genetic diversity mandates apply to families who choose genetic concentration as a form of cultural preservation. Senator Keene leaned forward, her expression one of practiced compassion. Ms. Harlan, can you speak to the health challenges your family has faced? Yes, Senator. I have epilepsy resulting from my genetic background. I require medication and monitoring, but I'm alive, educated, and capable of contributing to society. My condition is managed, not cured, which is true for millions of Americans with hereditary conditions. Should they all be prevented from reproducing? Should genetic risk alone determine reproductive rights? How do you argue against someone who's suffered, who bears the physical scars of what she's defending, and who's weaponized her own victimhood into a shield for the system that created it? The hearing room was mostly empty. These afternoon subcommittee sessions rarely drew crowds, but the dozen people present included 3 Heritage Network lawyers, Rebecca Harlan sitting behind Catherine, ready to support if she faltered, and 2 journalists covering it for regional papers. Senator Keene asked softball questions, clearly briefed by staffers who'd been lobbied by Heritage Network representatives. Other senators present seemed uncomfortable, but unwilling to challenge a disabled woman testifying about her family's civil rights. Then Senator Robert Morrison from Ohio, a former physician, asked the question Dr. Price had been praying someone would ask. Ms. Harlan, how many pregnancies occurred in your family in the last 10 years, and how many children from those pregnancies are alive today? Catherine hesitated. The lawyer behind her whispered something. Catherine took a breath. I don't have exact numbers, Senator. Families don't typically report every pregnancy to authorities. Approximately then, in your immediate family group, how many Bobbies were born and how many survived past infancy? Catherine's silence lasted 15 seconds, an eternity on recorded testimony. When she finally answered, her voice was quieter, less rehearsed. In my immediate family, 12 pregnancies resulted in 4 living children over the past 10 years. The math hung in the air. 12 pregnancies, 4 living children, a survival rate of 33%. Senator Morrison pressed, and the other 8. Miscarriages, stillbirths. Some lived briefly and had conditions incompatible with sustained life. Senator, these numbers are not unusual for high-risk pregnancies. Many families face similar losses, but those families aren't deliberately creating high-risk pregnancies through systematic inbreeding, are they? The room temperature seemed to drop. This wasn't scripted. Catherine's lawyers shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca half stood, then sat again, recognizing that intervention would look worse than silence. Catherine's answer, when it came, revealed something the Heritage Network hadn't wanted exposed. Senator, with respect, you're applying external values to internal family decisions. What you call deliberately creating high-risk pregnancies, we call accepting the natural consequences of preserving our bloodline. Every family makes reproductive choices involving risk assessment. We simply prioritize different values than mainstream society. At what point does accepting natural consequences become accepting preventable deaths? And who decides where that line exists? Senator Morrison looked disgusted. Ms. Harlan, I'm a physician. I've delivered Bobbies. I've counseled families on genetic risks. What you're describing isn't risk management, it's genetic Russian roulette with infant lives. And you want federal protection for it. Catherine's mask cracked. For just a moment, Dr. Price saw the frightened 17-year-old seizing in that mountain cabin, the girl whose family had asked if she could still breed, the victim who'd been transformed into an advocate through decades of psychological conditioning and limited alternatives. I want, Catherine said slowly, to stop being treated like a criminal for existing, for being born, for choosing to have children despite my genetics. Is that so unreasonable? The hearing concluded with no legislation recommended, no formal protections granted, but also no formal condemnation. A bureaucratic non-result that effectively maintained the status quo. Heritage Network families operating legally in a gray zone, monitored but not stopped, documented but not prosecuted. C-SPAN archived the footage. Regional papers ran brief stories about controversial testimony on genetic heritage rights. Bioethics journals published think pieces debating whether Catherine Harlan represented an edge case of reproductive autonomy or a clear example of how consent can be manufactured in coercive systems. Dr. Price called Senator Morrison's office that evening, identifying herself carefully as a physician familiar with the Harlan case. She was connected to a staffer who listened politely to her concerns, thanked her for calling, and assured her the senator took these matters seriously. Nothing happened. The Heritage Network issued a press release celebrating Catherine's brave testimony and thanking Senator Keene for providing a platform for marginalized voices. They posted the C-SPAN footage on their website, edited to remove Senator Morrison's challenging questions, presenting only Catherine's responses that framed the family as cultural preservation advocates. Like the normalization of conversion therapy through religious freedom arguments, like the protection of genital mutilation practices under cultural sensitivity frameworks, like every atrocity that learned to speak the language of rights and autonomy. The Heritage Network had discovered that democracy's mechanisms could be weaponized to protect what democracy's values should condemn. But the unedited C-SPAN footage contained something the Heritage Network didn't notice. During Catherine's testimony, as she spoke about 4 living children, the camera briefly panned to Rebecca Harlan sitting behind her. Rebecca's face showed an expression that contradicted every word being spoken, not pride or defiance, but something that looked like grief and trapped desperation. Her lips moved silently, forming words. A lip-reading expert hired by a journalist, one of Thomas Garrett's old colleagues, still quietly investigating, later identified what Rebecca mouthed during that moment. God forgive us. God forgive us all. And in that moment, captured on official government footage but seen by almost no one, the truth surfaced. The Heritage Network's advocates weren't true believers. They were prisoners who'd learned that the only way to survive their prison was to defend its walls, to call their chains freedom, to transform suffering into ideology, because admitting the suffering would make it unbearable. In 1998, Dr. Friedrich Halton died at age 95, and his will revealed he'd deposited frozen genetic material from 17 Harlan children in cryogenic storage facilities across 3 continents. The death was unremarkable, cardiac failure, expected at his age, in a Basel hospital surrounded by colleagues and former students who eulogized him as a pioneer in hereditary disease management and a compassionate advocate for genetic diversity preservation. Nature published a respectful obituary listing his academic achievements. The International Society of Human Genetics issued a statement acknowledging his controversial but scientifically rigorous contributions to understanding inbreeding depression. No one mentioned the basement operating rooms. No one mentioned Thomas Garrett or Jack Morrison. No one mentioned the 28 corrected children or the 9 sent to Europe who never returned. Halton died respected, honored, and legally untouchable. His will, probated in Swiss court, contained standard bequests: money to universities, his Basel apartment to a nephew, his research library to the Halton Institute. But buried in the estate inventory, discovered by an associate's clerk processing the paperwork, was something that shouldn't have existed. 17 vials of cryogenically preserved genetic material, sperm, eggs, embryonic tissue, and blood samples, stored in facilities in Switzerland, Singapore, and Argentina, each labeled with codes corresponding to specific Harlan family members, with maintenance fees paid through a trust fund established to last 150 years. The Swiss clerk, Marcus Hoffmann, was disturbed enough to contact Swiss authorities. They investigated, determined the materials were legally obtained. Consent forms existed, signed by Edmund Harlan in 1937, and updated with signatures from family members through 1995, and ruled the storage arrangement perfectly legal under Swiss biomedical law. The genetic material wasn't abandoned research waste. It was an insurance policy, a genetic backup. If the living Harlan line collapsed, if all current family members died, if the bloodline faced extinction, someone, someday, could theoretically resurrect it using Halton's preserved samples and modern reproductive technology. Dr. Price learned about the vials through a phone call from Marcus Hoffmann himself, who tracked her down through medical records showing her involvement with the Harlan case. Hoffman's English was precise, his concern genuine. "Dr. Price, I've read Dr. Halton's files. I understand now what he was doing. This isn't just genetic storage. This is a breeding program that survives his death. The trust fund details list authorized users who can access the material, 3 Heritage Network board members, 2 genetic researchers at the Halton Institute, and something called Harlan Family Genetic Continuity Council. These materials could be used indefinitely. How do you kill an ideology that's been frozen in time, waiting to be thawed and reproduced whenever someone decides the bloodline deserves another chance?" Dr. Price felt sick. Halton had treated the Harlan bloodline like an endangered species, preserving genetic samples the way conservationists preserve seeds in Arctic vaults. Except these weren't seeds. They were human reproductive material, taken from people who'd grown up in systems where consent was coerced, where agreeing to genetic preservation was framed as family duty and bloodline loyalty. The inventory revealed something worse. Among the 17 preserved samples were materials labeled Subject CH, collected 1978, age 17, pre-treatment genetic baseline. Catherine Harlan's eggs, taken before her epilepsy medication altered her reproductive chemistry, preserved without her explicit knowledge at a time when she was a minor and legally incompetent to consent to genetic material extraction. The Swiss investigation stalled. Consent forms existed, even if coerced. No Swiss laws were broken. Halton was dead, beyond prosecution. The Harlan family, contacted through Heritage Network lawyers, declined to demand destruction of the materials, stating they respected Dr. Halton's vision for genetic preservation and scientific advancement. International bioethics bodies issued statements about the need for clearer regulations regarding long-term genetic material storage, but no action was taken. The vials remained frozen, maintained, legally protected. Dr. Price tried contacting Catherine directly, sent letters to the last address she had, offering to help fight for destruction of her genetic material. Catherine responded 6 weeks later with a single handwritten sentence. "Let them keep it. It's all that's left of me that isn't broken." The trust fund documentation revealed the full scope of Halton's plan. The preserved genetic material was specifically intended for future reproductive technology applications, including but not limited to cloning, genetic modification, and embryonic reconstruction. Technologies that didn't fully exist in 1998, but that Halton clearly anticipated would become available. He'd been planning for a future where the Harlan bloodline could be not just preserved, but perfected, where genetic engineering could remove the defects his protocols could only manage, where Edmund Harlan's vision of genetic purity could be achieved through technology rather than through generations of suffering. The Halton Institute confirmed this in a press release responding to controversy about the vials. Dr. Halton believed that genetic heritage preservation would become increasingly important as reproductive technology advanced. His foresight in preserving these materials ensures that future generations will have options for genetic rescue that current generations lack. This is medical innovation, not exploitation. By 2000, discussions were already occurring in genetic research circles about genetic reconstruction of endangered bloodlines. Using Halton's preserved Harlan materials as a potential proof of concept for applying cloning and gene editing technologies to populations affected by inbreeding depression. If technology can fix the defects that inbreeding creates, does that make the inbreeding acceptable? Does the promise of future correction justify present suffering? Dr. Price watched as Halton's death somehow made his work more acceptable, not less. Dead men can be sanitized. Their crimes can be academically debated rather than legally prosecuted. Halton became a historical figure, his methods products of his time, his data valuable regardless of how it was obtained. Like the Nazi medical data used in modern hypothermia research protocols, like the Tuskegee data informing current STD treatment guidelines, like every knowledge base built on suffering that future generations must choose whether to use or reject. Halton's genetic samples posed an impossible ethical question. Can stolen genetic material ever be ethically used, even if using it could save lives? The Heritage Network held a memorial service for Halton in 1999, attended by 40 family members representing all the bloodlines he'd managed. Rebecca Harlan gave the eulogy, calling him the shepherd who guided us through the wilderness of genetic collapse into a future where our families can survive with dignity. Dr. Price did not attend, but she read the eulogy transcript and felt a familiar despair. The victims were mourning their architect. The prisoners were praising their jailer. The bloodline he'd both saved and damaged was genuinely grateful for his intervention. Because the alternative, acknowledging that their entire existence was built on systematic suffering, that their children and grandchildren were products of a eugenic experiment, that they'd volunteered for their own exploitation, was too psychologically devastating to confront. But Marcus Hoffman sent Dr. Price one final document before the Swiss investigation closed, an email exchange from 1997 between Halton and a Chinese geneticist named Dr. Wei Chen, discussing potential application of CRISPR gene editing technology to correct inbreeding-related mutations in preserved genetic material. Dr. Chen wrote, "If your samples are as genetically concentrated as you describe, they would be ideal for testing precision genetic modification. We could potentially create embryos from your stored material, edit out the problematic mutations, and produce offspring with the genetic purity your families seek but without the associated health defects. This could revolutionize how we think about genetic rescue." Halton responded, "Precisely my intention. The American families provided the baseline data. Now we can perfect what they began. Begin preparation for Phase 4 when ready." The future of genetic sovereignty isn't just preservation, it's improvement. Phase 4. Genetic editing. Creating designer bloodlines from frozen Harlan DNA. And somewhere in China in 1998, researchers were already preparing to make Edmund Harlan's 1935 vision reality using technology that could finally separate genetic concentration from genetic collapse. In 2003, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Mitchell began secretly recording Heritage Network families and discovered children being raised in what she called genetic preparation camps. Sarah Mitchell was 31, an independent filmmaker who'd built her reputation on intimate documentaries about marginalized communities. She'd heard about the Heritage Network through academic channels while researching a film about reproductive rights in isolated populations. Initially sympathetic to their genetic sovereignty messaging, she approached them requesting access to film family life from an insider perspective. Rebecca Harlan, now 56 and serving as Heritage Network's public relations coordinator, granted conditional access. Sarah could film, but only approved content, only with family consent, and only presenting the network in what Rebecca called contextually fair ways. Sarah agreed. She had no intention of honoring those conditions. For 18 months, from January 2003 through June 2004, Sarah embedded herself with 3 Heritage Network families across Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia. She filmed openly with network approval during designated times. But she also filmed secretly, hidden cameras in her bag, audio recorders disguised as jewelry, night vision equipment capturing conversations families thought were private. Sarah's hidden footage revealed that Heritage Network families had developed a systematic educational program for children as young as 8, teaching them bloodline mathematics, calculating their coefficient of inbreeding, memorizing family trees, and planning future reproductive pairings to maximize genetic concentration while minimizing defect probability. The children sat in basement classrooms, not unlike Edmund Harlan's teaching room from 70 years earlier, learning genetics not as science but as destiny. A 12-year-old girl named Emma from the Whitmore family appeared in Sarah's footage solving problems like, if your coefficient is 0.38 and you pair with your first cousin whose coefficient is 0.42, what is the probability your offspring will require medical intervention? Emma answered correctly, 63% based on family historical data, but managed intervention reduces that to 41%. The teacher, an adult Heritage Network member, herself a product of third-generation endogamy, praised her. Excellent. And this is why we study our bloodlines. Knowledge protects us. Mathematics guides us. Our ancestors bred blindly. We breed scientifically. At what point does education become indoctrination? When does teaching children their genetic heritage become programming them to accept their role in a breeding system? Sarah's footage showed children as young as 10 being shown photographs of potential future partners, cousins, second cousins, carefully selected based on genetic compatibility calculations. The children discussed these potential pairings matter-of-factly, the way other children might discuss college choices or career paths. A 13-year-old boy named Jacob from the Kessler family in Pennsylvania told Sarah's hidden camera, "I know I'll probably marry my cousin Rachel. Our coefficients are compatible, and Dr. Chen, the Chinese geneticist who'd corresponded with Halton, said our genetic profiles minimize cardiac defect risk. It's practical, and it's what my family needs." The footage revealed that Heritage Network had established what Sarah termed genetic preparation camps, summer programs where children from different heritage families met, socialized, and were subtly evaluated as potential cross-family breeding partners to introduce marginal genetic variation while maintaining overall bloodline concentration. These camps operated legally as cultural heritage summer programs, hosted at properties owned by network families, complete with activities like hiking and crafts, alongside genealogy workshops and family planning discussions, where teenagers discussed their future reproductive obligations. Sarah filmed a campfire session where 17-year-olds from 5 different heritage families sat in a circle discussing their generational duty. One girl spoke about being afraid of pregnancy complications. A Heritage Network counselor, a woman with nursing credentials who traveled between families providing medical support, responded, "Fear is natural. Our grandmothers were afraid too, but they chose courage. They chose family. And because of their sacrifice, you exist. Your children will be healthier than you are. Your grandchildren healthier still. This is the mathematics of genetic rescue. Each generation suffers less than the last." The girl nodded, seeming reassured. Sarah's hidden camera captured her wiping tears. Sarah's most disturbing footage came from a Heritage Network medical facility in rural Tennessee. A converted barn housing examination rooms, ultrasound equipment, and a small delivery suite where network physicians performed prenatal monitoring and deliveries for families who refused hospital care. The facility operated in a legal gray zone, licensed physicians providing voluntary medical care to patients who preferred culturally sensitive health care. But Sarah's footage showed what culturally sensitive meant. Genetic counseling sessions where pregnant women were told their fetuses showed markers for severe defects and were encouraged to consider the family's genetic trajectory when deciding whether to continue pregnancies. One woman, 24 weeks pregnant with her 4th child, received news that ultrasound showed probable neural tube defects. The physician, Dr. Michael Reeves, a licensed OB-GYN who'd been working with Heritage Network families since 1998, presented her options. Continue the pregnancy knowing the child will require significant lifelong care, or terminate now while it's still legal and try again with better genetic outcome probability. The woman cried. Her husband sat beside her silent. They asked for time to decide. Dr. Reeves nodded sympathetically. Of course, but understand the longer you wait, the fewer options you have, and your family is counting on you to make decisions that support the bloodline's health, not just this individual pregnancy. Is this genetic counseling or genetic coercion? Where's the line between providing information and applying pressure? Sarah's footage showed the woman returning 3 days later. She decided to terminate. Dr. Reeves performed the procedure in the converted barn facility. Sarah's hidden camera captured the aftermath. The woman sobbing while her husband held her, saying, we had to, for the family, for the bloodline, we had to." Sarah filmed for 18 months, documenting approximately 40 families, hundreds of hours of footage. She captured children learning to calculate their genetic worth, teenagers discussing arranged but consensual reproductive pairings, pregnant women making impossible choices under family pressure, and physicians providing technically legal care that served ideology as much as health. In June 2004, Sarah left the Heritage Network communities and began editing her documentary. She titled it Bloodlines, America's Hidden Genetic Experiment. She submitted it to the Sundance Film Festival in August 2004. In October 2004, Sarah Mitchell's apartment in Brooklyn was burglarized. The thieves took nothing of value, not her laptop, not her jewelry, not cash, but took every hard drive containing her documentary footage, her interview transcripts, and her research notes. Sarah had backup copies stored at a friend's apartment in Manhattan. 2 weeks after the Brooklyn burglary, that apartment was also burglarized, with only Sarah's backup drives taken. Sarah went public, contacted journalists, tried to explain what was happening. Most dismissed it as paranoia. One reporter from the Village Voice wrote a sympathetic piece about a filmmaker whose controversial documentary about isolated communities had apparently attracted unwanted attention from unknown parties. The article buried the real story. Systematic destruction of evidence documenting how Heritage Network families were raising children in systems designed to ensure generational continuation of genetic practices that medical ethics would condemn if anyone looked closely enough. Like the destroyed footage from Ruby Ridge, like the disappeared evidence from Waco, like every documentation of state-adjacent power that vanished before legal scrutiny could examine it, Sarah's documentary became another story about what could have been revealed, should have been revealed, but somehow never was. But Sarah had made one more backup that she told no one about. A single hard drive mailed to Dr. Helena Price in August 2004, accompanied by a note. Dr. Price, I read Thomas Garrett's old articles about you. I know you understand what I found. If something happens to my footage, this is the last copy that exists. I'm trusting you to know what to do with it. But I'll be honest, I don't know what to do with it either. Every frame of this documentary incriminates children who didn't choose this life, documents suffering I can't stop, and reveals a system that operates just legally enough that exposing it might make me the criminal instead of them. How do you fight? Something that's learned to speak the language of rights, consent, and cultural preservation. How do you save people who have been taught to defend their own exploitation? Sarah Mitchell. And in Dr. Price's home office, in October 2004, that hard drive sat in a locked drawer, containing hundreds of hours of footage that could expose everything or change nothing, depending on whether anyone with actual power cared enough to watch. In 2007, Dr. Price finally watched Sarah Mitchell's footage and discovered the Heritage Network had expanded to include a fourth-generation Harlan child who'd been genetically edited in a Chinese laboratory. The hard drive sat in Dr. Price's locked drawer for 3 years. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, the right authority to contact, the right legal framework to ensure the footage would be protected and properly investigated. But the truth was simpler and more cowardly. She was afraid. Afraid of what she'd see. Afraid of what she'd be obligated to do after seeing it. Afraid of becoming another Thomas Garrett, another Jack Morrison, another name added to the list of people who'd cared too much and paid with everything. But in March 2007, Catherine Harlan died. Seizure-related complications, according to the Heritage Network's public statement. She was 44 years old, her body destroyed by decades of genetic damage and epileptic episodes. Her life, a testimony to survival against biological odds that should have killed her in childhood. Her obituary appeared in the Charleston Gazette, written by the Heritage Network. Catherine Harlan, brave advocate for genetic sovereignty rights, passed peacefully surrounded by family. She dedicated her life to defending the rights of families like hers to make informed reproductive choices without government interference. She is survived by her daughter, her cousins, and a legacy of courage. Catherine had a daughter. Dr. Price hadn't known. The obituary listed her as Emma Harlan, age 7, which meant Catherine had been pregnant when she testified before the Senate in 1995, which meant the family had deliberately concealed the pregnancy to make her testimony more sympathetic. That night, Dr. Price opened the drawer, connected the hard drive, started watching Sarah Mitchell's footage. 473 hours of documentary material, organized by family and theme. Dr. Price watched for 16 hours straight, skipping meals, ignoring phone calls, descending into the documented reality of Heritage Network family life in the early 2000s. She saw the genetic preparation camps, the children calculating coefficients, the pregnant women facing impossible choices, the physicians providing technically legal care that served eugenics disguised as cultural preservation. And then at hour 14, she found the footage Sarah had marked urgent, verify independently in the file metadata. What could be urgent enough to mark separately in a documentary, already filled with systematic genetic exploitation? The footage was from February 2004, filmed at a Heritage Network conference in Louisville. Sarah's hidden camera captured a closed-door session titled New Frontiers in Genetic Rescue, a panel discussion among Heritage Network medical advisors, including Dr. Michael Reeves, the OB-GYN from the Tennessee facility, and Dr. Wei Chen, the Chinese geneticist who'd corresponded with Halton before his death. Dr. Chen spoke about successful application of CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing to correct mutations in genetically concentrated populations. His PowerPoint presentation showed charts, graphs, success rates. Then he showed photographs. A Chinese laboratory, Petri dishes containing embryos, and one slide showing a healthy infant labeled Subject H4, Generation 4 Harlan line, post-editing specimen, born August 2003. A baby created from Halton's frozen genetic material, genetically edited to remove inbreeding-related mutations, and carried to term by a surrogate mother in Guangzhou. Dr. Price stopped the video, rewound, watched again. The baby in the photograph had the characteristic Harlan facial features, the compressed structure, the amber-toned eyes, but without the obvious deformities that marked previous generations. The child looked healthy, almost impossibly so for someone with such a concentrated genetic background. Dr. Chen's voiceover. This represents the culmination of Dr. Halton's vision. We took genetic material from two fourth-generation Harlan family members, samples preserved since 1997, created embryos with a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.44, then used CRISPR to target and correct 17 genetic mutations associated with neurological defects, cardiac abnormalities, and developmental delays. The resulting child shows no markers for hereditary conditions, normal cognitive development, and genetic concentration maintained at desired levels. Applause from the Heritage Network audience. Someone asked, "Is the child here in America now?" Dr. Chen smiled. "That information is protected for the family's privacy. But I can tell you that multiple heritage families have expressed interest in this protocol. We've begun conversations about establishing a partnership between our laboratory and your network to provide these services more broadly." How many genetically edited children were already living among Heritage Network families? Their existence hidden, their modified DNA a secret experiment in real-time eugenics. Dr. Price kept watching. The panel discussion revealed more. Dr. Chen's laboratory had performed successful genetic editing on material from 6 heritage families. 3 pregnancies had resulted. 2 children were born as of February 2004, the Harlan child and one from the Whitmore family. 1 pregnancy was ongoing. The panel discussed logistics of bringing edited embryos to America for implantation in family members, legal complexities of international reproductive technology transfer, and whether Heritage Network should establish its own gene editing facility on American soil to avoid international legal complications. Dr. Reeves raised the critical question: what about FDA oversight? Gene editing of human embryos isn't legal in the United States. Isn't approved, Dr. Chen corrected. There's a difference. No federal law explicitly prohibits what we're doing. The FDA simply hasn't created regulatory frameworks yet, and by the time they do, we'll have demonstrated successful outcomes. Fait accompli. The children will exist. What are they going to do? Order them terminated? Someone laughed. Dr. Price felt nauseous. Rebecca Harlan spoke from the audience. "Is Emma eligible for this protocol? Catherine's daughter. She's showing early signs of seizure disorder. If we could correct that genetically before it develops fully." Emma, Catherine's 7-year-old daughter. The child whose existence Dr. Price had just learned about from an obituary. Dr. Chen checked notes. "Emma's genetic profile is already in our database. She'd be an excellent candidate. The procedure would require extracting some of her cells, creating cloned embryos, editing them, and then, well, that's where it gets complicated. We can't edit her existing genetics. We can only create a genetically edited version of her, a kind of genetic twin optimized." Rebecca's response caught clearly on Sarah's hidden audio. So Emma would have a sister who's essentially a corrected version of herself. Would we? Would we be expected to choose between them? Silence in the room. Then Dr. Chen carefully, "That's a family decision. Some families might choose to raise both children. Others might decide the edited version represents the future of the bloodline and focus resources there. We don't make those determinations. We provide technology. You provide values." Dr. Price stopped the video again. sat in her dark office, feeling like she was watching the prelude to something that shouldn't exist in civilized society: genetic replacement, creating optimized versions of living children, then forcing families to choose which version deserved to continue existing. Like the replacement children phenomenon in Scientology, like the Nazi T4 program's hierarchy of human worth, like every system that taught people to evaluate human life based on genetic fitness, the Heritage Network had found a new frontier for their ideology: not just managing defective bloodlines, but editing them, optimizing them, creating designer versions of children who already existed. The footage continued. Dr. Chen discussed costs: $250,000 per successful birth, success rates 47%, and future developments including potential editing of adult genetic material to correct existing individuals rather than creating new ones. The Heritage Network audience asked questions about insurance, legal risks, religious implications. Not one person asked whether this was ethical. Not one person questioned whether creating genetically edited humans in Chinese laboratories to perfect inbred American bloodlines violated any moral framework worth maintaining. They'd crossed so many lines already that this was just one more step, one more technology in service of an ideology that had survived Edmund Harlan's death, survived Halton's death, survived public scrutiny and federal investigation and journalistic exposure, because it had learned to evolve, adapt, and weaponize every new scientific advancement to justify its continued existence. But the footage's final segment, marked confidential, not for distribution in Sarah's notes, showed something even Dr. Chen seemed uncomfortable with. A Heritage Network lawyer named David Morrison, no relation to the private investigator, presenting a legal strategy document titled Phase 5: Genetic Sovereignty Through Technological Superiority. The document argued that once heritage families had access to genetic editing technology, they would produce children genetically superior to naturally conceived children from non-endogamous populations. Imagine, Morrison said, a generation of heritage children with the genetic concentration their families value, but without the associated health defects. They'd be proof that genetic sovereignty isn't just about rights, it's about results. We transform from victims seeking protection to pioneers demonstrating advancement. And when we can show that our genetically edited children are healthier, smarter, longer-lived than average Americans, suddenly genetic sovereignty becomes genetic supremacy. And supremacy doesn't ask for rights, it claims them. The room erupted in applause. And somewhere in that applause, Dr. Price heard the future. Not just the Harlan bloodline surviving, but thriving, multiplying, using technology to perfect what ideology began, creating a genetic aristocracy that would justify Edmund Harlan's 1935 vision as tragically premature but ultimately correct. Dr. Price contacted the FBI in 2008 with Sarah's footage. They already knew about the gene-edited children and had classified them as strategic genetic research. Special Agent Crawford, the same agent who'd silenced her in 1979, now grade and senior, met her at a D.C. coffee shop. He didn't seem surprised by her call. "Dr. Price, been expecting you." He slid a folder across the table. "Sign before we talk." Another NDA. 20 years after the first, another gag order. She signed. Crawford sipped coffee. "We know about the Chinese lab. We've known since 2002. We monitor it." "You're allowing this?" "We're studying it. 3 edited heritage children exist. All healthy. all showing remarkable outcomes. This is the most comprehensive human gene editing data available outside classified military research. The FBI had embedded an agent inside the Heritage Network since 2001. One of the sympathetic physicians was actually bureau surveillance, documenting everything for a classified research program called Project Continuity. Crawford showed her sanitized files. The project tracked heritage families as a controlled population study in genetic management and reproductive autonomy. The gene-edited children were considered invaluable data points for future biotechnology policy. "You're using them," Dr. Price said. "We're learning from them. Big difference. These families chose this. We're just watching." When does observation become complicity? "What about Emma?" Dr. Price asked. "Catherine's daughter. Are they creating an edited version of her?" Crawford nodded. Embryo was created in 2006, currently in cryogenic storage. Family hasn't decided on implantation yet. The girl's seizures are manageable with medication. They're waiting to see if she worsens. "That's monstrous." "That's their right. She's their daughter, their genetics, their choice." Crawford leaned forward. "Dr. Price, you can't stop this. The technology exists. Other countries are doing it. If we ban it, it just moves somewhere we can't monitor. Better to track it, understand it, prepare for when it becomes widespread." Crawford revealed that 5 other countries were conducting similar gene editing programs on isolated populations: Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Israel, and India, all monitored by international intelligence agencies as part of genetic research surveillance. "It's coming whether you like it or not," Crawford said. "Designer Bobbies, genetic optimization. Within 20 years, wealthy families will edit embryos routinely. The Heritage Network is just ahead of the curve." Dr. Price went home defeated. The footage that should have exposed everything changed nothing. The system was too big, too distributed, too protected. 3 weeks later, Sarah Mitchell contacted Dr. Price, alive but hiding in Montreal. "I knew they'd bury it," Sarah said, "so I'm releasing everything online, anonymously. Let the world decide." In April 2008, 400 hours of documentary footage appeared on file-sharing networks. Raw, unedited, completely documented. It was downloaded 17,000 times in 3 days. Then the files vanished, removed by copyright claims from entities that didn't exist. But enough people saw it. Bioethicists started asking questions. Journalists began investigating. And in Kentucky, a Heritage Network teenager named Jacob Kessler, the same boy who'd matter-of-factly discussed marrying his cousin, contacted a human rights lawyer and said 5 words that would crack everything open. "I want to leave. Help me." Jacob Kessler's escape attempt in 2009 triggered the first criminal investigation into Heritage Network. But prosecutors discovered every family member would testify against him. Jacob was 19, legally an adult with every right to leave. But heritage families didn't see it that way. His departure wasn't freedom, it was betrayal. The human rights lawyer Monica Ferrara took his case pro bono. Jacob described years of genetic indoctrination, arranged future pairings, psychological pressure to accept his bloodline duty. But when investigators interviewed his family, his mother said, "Jacob is confused. We never forced anything. He's having a mental health crisis." His father added, "We supported his education, his health. He's making accusations because he's fallen in with outside influences." 12 Heritage Network families filed restraining orders against Monica Ferrara, claiming she was kidnapping and brainwashing a vulnerable young man suffering from genetic-related cognitive impairment. They had medical documentation. Jacob's IQ tested at 87, below average, attributed to mild hereditary developmental delays. Doctors confirmed he had difficulty with complex decision-making. The families argued he lacked capacity to make informed choices about leaving. Monica fought back. Jacob wasn't impaired, he was educated differently, taught genetics instead of critical thinking, raised to accept rather than question. How do you prove someone has autonomy when their entire childhood was designed to eliminate it? The case gained media attention. Washington Post covered it as genetic rights versus individual freedom. Heritage Network positioned Jacob as a victim of outside manipulation, not internal coercion. Rebecca Harlan gave interviews. Jacob grew up loved, supported, and educated about his heritage. Now strangers are telling him his family is evil, his genetics are shameful, his culture is abuse. Who's really exploiting him? Jacob recanted. At a televised press conference in November 2009, standing beside his family, he apologized for allowing myself to be manipulated by people who don't understand our way of life. Monica knew it was coerced, but Jacob was legally adult. He'd made his statement voluntarily. The case collapsed. Jacob returned to his Kentucky community. 6 months later, Heritage Network announced his engagement to his cousin Rachel, exactly as planned. The criminal investigation closed. No charges filed. No laws broken. Just a young man exercising his right to choose his family's values over outside interference. But Monica received an encrypted email 3 months later. I didn't recant because I changed my mind. I recanted because they showed me what happens to people who don't. Thomas Garrett, Jack Morrison, Sarah Mitchell's apartment, they have resources, they have connections. And they told me if I continued, my younger siblings would require genetic correction. I understood. I chose them over me. But Ms. Ferrara, they're expanding. More families joining every year. More children being raised in this system. Someone needs to stop them. I just can't be that someone, I'm sorry. J.K. By 2012, Heritage Network operated in 18 states with over 200 families. And Dr. Price discovered they'd started recruiting through online genetic testing services. Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, millions of Americans uploading genetic data, searching for relatives, building family trees. Heritage Network found them there. Dr. Price learned about it from a mother in Ohio who contacted her after her daughter, age 16, received a Facebook message from someone claiming to be a distant cousin who wanted to discuss family genetic heritage preservation. The message led to a Heritage Network recruiter who explained that the girl's DNA showed markers indicating significant consanguinity in recent generations. Her parents were third cousins who'd married without knowing it. Heritage Network had developed an algorithm that scanned public genetic databases for families showing endogamy patterns, then reached out offering genetic counseling, community support, and connection with families facing similar situations. They weren't kidnapping people. They were recruiting them, offering belonging to families who'd accidentally practiced endogamy and now faced genetic consequences. The pitch was seductive. You're not alone. You're not aberrant. You're part of a heritage that values family loyalty over social conformity. We can help you manage the medical challenges. We can connect you with others who understand. How do you fight recruitment that offers genuine support for genuine problems, even if it leads to systematic exploitation? Dr. Price tracked 12 families recruited this way between 2010 and 2012. All started with genetic testing. All discovered unexpected consanguinity. All felt ashamed, isolated. All were contacted by Heritage Network within months. The network had partnerships with 3 genetic counselors who worked for commercial DNA testing companies. They flagged high consanguinity results and referred families to Heritage Network as a support resource. It was legal. The counselors disclosed their Heritage Network affiliation. Families consented to contact. No laws violated. But the outcome was clear. Heritage Network was actively growing, targeting vulnerable families, offering community in exchange for accepting genetic sovereignty ideology. By 2015, Heritage Network estimated membership at 287 families across 21 states. And in 2016, they made their boldest move yet, filing a federal lawsuit demanding recognition as a genetic minority population, entitled to protections under civil rights law. The case was Heritage Genetics Network v. United States Department of Health and Human Services, and it would reach the Supreme Court by 2019. The Supreme Court case divided America, and in 2019, a 5-4 decision granted Heritage Network limited protections as a cultural genetic minority. The ruling was narrow but devastating. Justice Samuel Chen, no relation to Dr. Wei Chen, wrote the majority opinion. While this court does not endorse the practices of the Heritage Genetics Network, we cannot deny that isolated populations practicing multi-generational endogamy constitute a distinct genetic and cultural group. Their reproductive choices, however medically inadvisable, are protected under fundamental rights to family autonomy and bodily sovereignty. The decision didn't legalize everything Heritage Network did, but it established that genetic concentration practices couldn't be criminalized solely because they violated conventional genetic diversity norms. The ruling created a legal framework that 23 other isolated communities immediately used to claim similar protections. Fundamentalist religious groups, ethnic enclaves practicing cousin marriage, and even wealthy families seeking to preserve genetic legacies. Dr. Price watched from her retirement home in Charleston. She was 72 now, exhausted by decades of witnessing horror protected by law. Rebecca Harlan gave a victory speech on the Supreme Court steps. Today, America recognized that genetic diversity isn't the only way to be human, that families have the right to define their own biological futures. That difference isn't deviance. She was 68, her body broken by 7 pregnancies, her face marked by genetic compression. But she smiled like someone who'd won. Had she won, or had she simply secured the right to continue suffering? The Heritage Network expanded rapidly after the ruling. New clinics opened. Gene editing partnerships with international labs formalized. Genetic counseling programs trained more families in bloodline mathematics. By 2020, the network estimated over 400 families involved, with thousands of children being raised in systems teaching genetic concentration as cultural heritage. Emma Harlan, Catherine's daughter, now 19, became the network's youngest spokesperson, speaking at conferences about growing up in a genetically sovereign family and how genetic editing had saved her from her mother's seizure fate. The edited embryo created from Emma's genetics had been implanted in a surrogate in 2015. That child, genetically Emma's twin but optimized, was now 5 years old, healthy, and called Emma's genetic sister. Emma spoke about it openly. My sister is what my mother wanted for me, a version without the suffering. We're both real, we're both loved, and we're both proof that genetic sovereignty works. Dr. Price watched the speech online, saw Emma's compressed features, her medicated stability, her rehearsed confidence. And she wondered, was Emma free? Or was she the most perfectly imprisoned person alive, convinced her cage was a kingdom? But in 2021, everything changed. A pandemic swept the world, and Heritage Network families, with their concentrated genetics and compromised immune systems, began dying at rates 3 times the national average. The genetic purity they'd preserved for generations made them uniquely vulnerable. And as hospitals filled with Heritage Network members gasping for air, the question finally surfaced. Had they preserved a bloodline or just accelerated its extinction? In 2024, Dr. Helena Price died at age 89, and her will contained one final revelation that burned everything down. She documented everything, every conversation, every NDA violation, every piece of evidence she'd collected over 66 years. And she'd arranged for its release upon her death, sent simultaneously to 50 journalists, human rights organizations, and congressional offices. 6,000 pages, 400 hours of video, testimony from 37 sources, evidence of federal complicity, international genetic experiments, recruitment through DNA databases, and gene-edited children created without proper ethical oversight. The files went viral within hours. Among Dr. Price's documents was a letter from Rebecca Harlan, written in 2020 but never sent, confessing, "We were victims who became perpetrators. We were damaged people who damaged others. And we called it heritage. I'm 66 years old. I've had 9 pregnancies. 4 children survived. And I would trade all of them to undo what we've created. But it's too late. The bloodline continues. The ideology spreads. And we can't stop it anymore, even if we wanted to. Because we taught our children that suffering for genetic purity was noble, and now they believe it. God forgive us. We created hell and called it home." Rebecca never sent the letter, never recanted publicly, but Dr. Price had it, and now the world did too. The Heritage Network collapsed within 6 months. Federal investigations launched. Gene editing partnerships dissolved. Families fractured as younger members fled, older members denied, and children born into the system tried to understand what they were. How do you prosecute an ideology? How do you heal people who were taught their trauma was tradition? By 2025, 17 Heritage Network leaders faced federal charges, not for genetic practices, but for fraud, coercion, and violation of international laws regarding genetic experimentation on minors. Emma Harlan testified against her own family. At 23, she'd finally recognized what Dr. Price had known all along. Consent extracted through lifelong indoctrination isn't consent. It's just sophisticated captivity. The gene-edited children, now numbering 43 worldwide, were placed in a unique legal category: genetically modified persons, with special protections, medical monitoring, and legal status still being determined by international courts. They existed, they were healthy, they were human, but they were also products of experiments that most nations now condemned. What do you do with living proof of successful but unethical science? The Harlan Mansion in West Virginia, empty since 1973, was demolished in 2024. Workers found the basement operating room still intact, jars of preserved organs still lining the walls, Edmund Harlan's family tree painted in chalk still visible. They burned it all, consecrated the ground, built nothing there. Some places, once cursed, should remain empty. Dr. Price's final document, marked "Read Last," contained one confession. I was complicit. I stayed silent for decades. I signed NDAs. I watched children suffer and did nothing because I was afraid. Thomas Garrett tried to expose this in 1988. He died for it. I lived because I was a coward. But cowardice has a price. I carry the weight of every child I could have saved and didn't. Every family I could have broken and didn't. Every moment I chose my safety over their freedom. The Harlans built a genetic prison, but I helped them maintain it by staying silent. And that's a sin I'll carry into whatever judgment waits. To anyone reading this, the Harlan bloodline is just one story. There are others. Isolated communities, genetic experiments, families calling exploitation heritage. Find them, expose them, be braver than I was. And remember, some bloodlines shouldn't be preserved. Some legacies should die. And some silences kill more surely than any genetic defect ever could. The Harlan story ends with me, but the question remains, how many more stories like this are still being written, right now, protected by silence and fear? Dr. Helena Price, January 2024.